Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cinematic Schematic, the official podcast of the Cinematropolis.com, your home to thoughtful conversations on film. I'm your host, Caleb Masters, and today we are reviewing what has been one of the most anticipated movies of the year, conveniently directed by the Marvel Cinematic Universe's arch-nemesis, and it was made here in Oklahoma, but actually based on a really terrible tragedy. We're going to unpack all of that in today's podcast because we are reviewing Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon. We're going to start with a couple of icebreaker questions just to wrap our heads around what all of the guests today have to say about both the history, the historical events, but also the relationship with Scorsese films. And then we're going to jump into a spoiler-free review of the film where we'll render a verdict, and then we'll conclude the show with an in-depth spoiler discussion. And man, we have an amazing panel today. I'm very excited to be joined by this specific group of individuals. But first up, of course, he's my ride or die co-host. He's an award-winning Oklahoma filmmaker, and he was excited about this movie, I think. Laron Chapman, welcome to the show.
It's good to be back. I feel like with the announcement of this film, or, now that it's released and hundreds and, well, hopefully millions of people have seen it, it's introducing my second favorite season, just behind Halloween, which is Oscar season. Yes. And I think this will be a really big player in that race. So very excited to talk about the film today.
Absolutely. Laron, I think this movie has been coming almost as long as I've known you.
Yeah.
In fact, I got married recently, and we were talking about it. I was like, this movie's been coming. It's been on my mind longer than I've known my wife. It's insane.
That is insane.
So it's been anticipated for quite a while.
And it does feel like we've been talking about this movie for quite a while. So it is very nice to finally see the finished product.
Absolutely. So. Joining us today, our first special guest, she's an arts and entertainment features writer from the Oklahoman. She's also a member of the Oklahoma Film Critics Circle. Rejoining us from our Oscars predictions episode earlier this year, Brandy McDonnell, a.k.a. BAM. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I appreciate being here.
Next up, very excited to be rejoined by Sunrise Tippeconnie, who is now the director of programming at the deadCenter Film Festival. He also co-hosts the Reel Indigenous podcast, and he's an Oklahoma filmmaker. Sunrise, welcome to the show, and congrats on the new gig.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, like always. It's always nice to be in this room, and yeah, it's a different life for me. It's very exciting, and I'm just... I don't even know how to contain myself sometimes. The fact that I get to go into the office every day and just like think about films and work through film programming, work with filmmakers, I feel very privileged.
Awesome.
So, yeah, and I'm excited. I'm excited for the next year's festival.
Well, I'm excited to see what you do at the festival. When I saw the announcement come through, I was like, Sunrise, this guy is basically born to do this type of job. You've been involved with the festival for many years and been a really big player, but it's great to see you step into the full-time director role, so congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Some things just fit like a glove,
Yes.
And joining us for the first time, I'm very thrilled to welcome, she is the co-host and producer of the Reel Indigenous podcast, Angela Startz. Angela, welcome to the Cinematic Schematic.
Quiana for the invitation to join you.
Well, thank you for coming. We crossed paths at deadCenter very briefly because I was running around like a guy with his chicken with his head cut off, essentially.
And we spent probably 5 very steamy moments together in the dark.
Talking to Lily Gladstone.
It's
true. I was sweaty. It was a very enclosed room.
We were all sweaty.
I'm glad you clarified steamy because you went right into that in the dark and was like, please, what do we say? Then you said Lily Gladstone. It all comes together.
But yes, at deadCenter Film Festival, listeners may know that Lily Gladstone was in attendance, and we never published the interview on my show.
We were able to.
Were you able to?
We did. We dropped it as an opener for women that inspire us, Indigenous women that inspire us.
That's amazing.
And we ran it during Indian Market.
Yeah, Indian Market.
Wow.
With Jane Myers.
Yeah, it's a great episode.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Jane was producer on Prey, right?
Correct.
Yeah, we had her on a much earlier show along with Sunrise. Another really awesome movie, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, Angela, our paths have crossed. I've listened to a handful of episodes of your show, which I'm a big fan of. Maybe you could tell me a little more about yourself and on also your podcast, but I don't know you that well outside of these interactions.
I am Inupiaq from the Lanes and the Schaefers from Kotzebue and Point Hope. I grew up in Oklahoma, though, and I've been making films. The first film I was ever in was Sunrise, his short film.
Really?
Yes.
Oh. short film called
Contest.
Contest. That was like 2004 when it was
Yeah.
released.
Oh, wow.
So that was the first film I was ever in.
Very cool.
Long history.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Wow.
And so after that, we had Film Club, and we made a film. Film Club makes a film.
Mm-hmm.
I got my degree in radio, television, and film production from the University of Oklahoma, and have worked on and off ever since then in film and television here in the state. I've worked commercials, films, television shows, all kinds of things.
So very, like Sunrise, plugged into the filmmaking aspect as well as, especially with your podcast, Reel Indigenous, honing in on Indigenous stories being told. Could you elaborate? Tell me more about the podcast. What's maybe the pitch for listeners who aren't familiar?
Reel Indigenous looks at the depiction of Indigenous people in modern media. And so we examine not only film, but also television, fashion, what else?
Novels and plays.
Graphic novels.
Yeah, graphic novels.
Plays.
And, social media.
We looked at a lot of influencers. So we want to take a full spectrum look at modern Indigenous media and who's making it, why they're making it, how they're making it, and hold their feet to the fire if it's not really working.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Again, that's Reel Indigenous, so REEL, Indigenous. And would you say? I'm curious, as a person who has not been especially plugged into Indigenous media outside of these occasional breakthroughs in the mainstream, has it really been lately that there's more Indigenous media, or is it just more popular?
It's insane. We started this whole podcast just because of Reservation Dogs, and we were looking at it episode by episode. But then there was like all Rutherford Falls, and then Dark Winds, and then this explosion on TikTok of all these Indigenous
Influencers.
performers on
jewelry,
TikTok. Fashion exploded.
Yeah.
And it's just, we are very fortunate. We were going to take a break between season 1 and season 2. Nope. There was too much to cover.
That's amazing.
It's so great.
I think it's the power of representation. You know what I mean? You put it out there, then all of a sudden the interest is there. And it's like you have to start dispelling these myths that people aren't interested in these kinds of stories because they're eating it up when it's there, And so, and who's telling us that these stories aren't important, and who's telling us that these stories aren't of interest to mainstream media, So,
yes.
But
it's giving the power back to us, the power of telling our stories. And, that's who we are. We're storytellers. That we didn't have written books and stuff. We passed down our histories orally and performatively. I mean, I was, just being up in Alaska, the dances that we do tell the stories, tell the history of our people. So to see it moving into new media is really very exciting.
yeah.
Again, Angela, welcome to the show. So happy to have you today. Thank you for carving out time and coming straight to us from Alaska. Now, listeners, before we get into today's discussion, I just wanted to note that if you're listening and you enjoy the conversation, please make sure to support us by subscribing and leaving us a rating and a review on your preferred podcast app. This is most important on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And I know you get to click a couple buttons and it takes a few seconds, but I've got some stuff linked in the show notes for you to make it really easy. If you could do that for us, that'll help us get discovered by more listeners just like you. Now, a couple of special disclaimers I want to note. First up, I made the joke about the Martin Scorsese, Marvel Cinematic Universe at the top. But on this podcast, we're probably going to laugh at times, and we're going to be serious at times. But I want to make it very clear that this film is covering a very serious subject matter, which is the murder of, I want to say, definitely more than dozens. Dozens doesn't seem like it's enough people, right? It's probably a lot more.
The numbers fluctuate. It seems I've heard 60, I've heard hundreds, I've heard. But
not to mention, there's the ongoing repercussions of
the official number is 24, according to the FBI, but almost everybody agrees that the official number is not reflective of
Well,
the
it's
total
also
number.
it's also responsible for the diaspora of the Osage from this area because so many of them left in order to preserve their lives.
Yeah.
sure.
It's not a laughing matter. So I just want to make it very clear that, underneath all the discussion we have today, we do take that very seriously. The other thing we take very seriously is historical accuracy. And the reason I say that is because this is a podcast where we're going to be reviewing the film. We're going to be analyzing the film. And we're going to be talking about the sorts of impacts the film had when it was being made, has had, and will have. While we talk about the history and do our best to ensure we get all of the facts correct, please note that we will not be going down a list of comparisons to the book, for example, or doing dozens of facts checks on the history, as much as we are really focused on talking about how well or not the history is presented and fits together in the context of the film, and also how the creative choices taken by Scorsese and team will shape how the story is represented in the wider world. Again, though we're never going to argue against the importance of historical accuracy, we think it's very important. I do want to acknowledge that there are many, many details that are left out of the film as an adaptation to the big screen. And if you have things that you want to say on this matter or things we don't hit on today, I do welcome your comments, your concerns, and your feedback to our inbox, which is the cinematropolis@gmail.com. Or you can also hit us up on any of our Cinematropolis social media channels, most notably Facebook, Twitter, or Threads. With that said, let's talk about what we all are bringing to the table in terms of the understanding of the Osage Reign of Terror before watching Killers of the Flower Moon. We'll go around the table. Listeners can't see this, but I'll start with you, Brandy, and then we'll go to Sunrise, Angela, and then Laron. So, Brandy, what exactly was your knowledge before Killers of the Flower Moon of the murders?
Before the movie or before the book?
Tell me both.
Okay. So my mom actually grew up in Burbank, which is in Osage County. So I actually was a little bit familiar with the history of that place because by the time I was born, my mother had not lived there anymore. But that was where she grew up as a little girl. And then when she was in high school, her family moved to near Joplin, Missouri. And then my grandparents always lived in Wynnewood when I was growing up. So she didn't live there anymore, but that was the place where she was a little girl. And so we would go and visit. She did have relatives there and things like that. And we would go and visit it. And so I knew that the Osage Nation was there. And so I became somewhat familiar with Osage history. So I knew that there was a little bit of history with the Osage when it comes to the oil boom and that there had been this reign of terror. So I was sort of like a little bit knew about the history of the area and had known that there had been an oil boom and that there had been a lot of tragedy. And then there was an oil bust and how, it was basically, almost like areas that are depicted in the movie, like Fairfax and things like that, are like almost like ghost towns. I mean, they're not thriving communities anymore. Pawhuska is, but not the rest of Osage County. So I was sort of a little bit familiar with it. And so remember, the rights for the book sparked a bidding war in 2016 before the book was even published. So when that bidding war kind of broke out, I was like, what is this about? And I was like, oh, that's what somebody did a book about that? And so then I was like, okay, what do I remember about that? And so I refreshed myself then on the history. And as a grown person, it's like, it sinks in like much more how much more horrific it was. So I had like researched it, and then the book came out and read the book and then followed extensively the making of the film.
Right. So again, you had a little bit of knowledge just from growing up nearby, but not a lot of real quality information until the book came out, in which you were able to really dive into it.
Certainly not anything that I learned in school. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Well said. Sunrise, how about you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Even though I'm of the Comanche tribe, I'm officially enrolled in the Comanche tribe. I have other tribal affiliations. My mother's Navajo, and I've got some Cherokee in me. But on my father's side, he's Comanche. We have cousins and families that are Osage. And so I've been around the Osage through that side of the family since I was, I don't know how young I would interact with them on a summerly basis. But that being said, the information that was given was always sort of very informal. It was like these things happened, and it's also, not dwelling on a lot of facts because it's related to trauma. And it's, the redirecting resulted in, forms of resilience, I guess, focusing on culture and on history that's more individual and alive and more maybe immediate. But it was always sort of like it hidden underneath discussions of, well, why this person wasn't around, or what happened to this particular family's relationships to each other, to the government, to all these other different things, and housing, and all these different things. But what's interesting is, like, once I get a little bit older and A Pipe for February comes out. That's where I start to really get a sense of it a little bit. And that really, maybe about 2013 is kind of where I really start to associate the specific facts and just the term of Reign of Terror or something that I would hear. But I never associate it with like the specific family histories. So that was an interesting sort of way to, I guess, cohere. So by the time the grand book comes out, I felt like I was able to suddenly bring and bridge all this information. I was like, oh, this is directly related to people that I know. It was overwhelming a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just out of curiosity, did you having friends in the Osage, was it something that once the novel came out, did more discussion come about because of it? Less discussion?
That's a good question. I actually feel like I haven't talked about this with like my Osage relatives. Like that's something, again, we just don't talk about. Right. It seems like it's mostly people that are not Osage that talk about it, or people that are, somehow related to like the operations of the nation or affiliated with like contact with the production. I think that's when it comes up. Although I will say that an Osage friend is the one that gave me the Pipe for February book, where I started to cohere a lot of the facts in a formal way. But that was maybe the way to discuss it. It's not like we talked about it, which is very interesting.
Well, I'll turn to you, Angela. What is your knowledge of the Osage Reign of Terror, so to speak?
Well, growing up here, I had always heard that the Osage were the richest Indians in Oklahoma, and because of their oil, and that was kind of the extent of the conversation. And when I was working at OU, somebody had written a script about head rights and had brought it to me to read through. And that was basically the first time I was ever aware of it. And then after that, I got Pipe for February and started that. And the same thing as Sunrise said, the Killers of the Flower Moon book kind of brought it all together, kind of pulled all those whispers that you hear in your community and just made it more clear and more defined. And it really opens up how corrupt the system was that was in place, that even we didn't know was happening. So it really opened up a different layer of knowledge about how destructive these people were to that community.
Yeah. So again, it sounds like the novel really did, even though there was obviously a clear understanding that something terrible happened, the novel really put it out into the light, so to speak. Laron, what is your knowledge of the story?
Sadly, my knowledge of the story came about as the profile for David Gann's, book came out. And so even then, though, I feel that I still was not aware of who all was involved and the motivations for why they were involved. So to be honest, the film itself now has given me, like at least a nice rough draft of the who's who, who did this, who did that, and the why, And so I feel like as the presence of that story became, as the production in our state, became like my interest in that particular history in this particular story, just kind of grew and grew and grew. And so now I can't get enough of reading all of the articles from different people's perspectives on it. I read an article with the Washington Post just recently, where Molly Burkhart's granddaughter, who just talking about the long-term generational trauma that's come from just her direct lineage, so which I also think is ripe for an adaptation. That's a story that could be told by an Osage person, and it would still tangentially be, connected to this particular story and this history, but just not specifically about the FBI case, but how it affected the family that was the direct descendants of her. I think so. Yeah, my knowledge of it came from the high profile of the book.
Yeah, I mean, mine's pretty similar to Laron. I had heard of the book, and but honestly, I don't think I really understood much about the story whatsoever until I saw that Martin Scorsese and Leo were attached shortly after the bidding war. And I was like, okay, so what's the deal? It's set in Oklahoma. That's interesting. So I start Googling and reading up about it. And turns out it's a horrible story. I really haven't done the best job at understanding that there's been a great injustice done to indigenous peoples throughout American history. That understanding I've had clear for a while, but the specifics of it have really been lost on me, and I haven't done the homework. The novel coming out really sparked my interest in doing just more research on the story, although I haven't read the novel myself. But I also followed the production here in Oklahoma really closely. Not as close as Bam, who is in it, but I anytime a story would come out, I'd be like, okay, what's the deal? What's the story? Oh, they cast XYZ. Oh, they rewrote the script.
Yeah,
that's an interesting choice that we're going to talk about later. But also, I mean, not that it's really super valuable in terms of my knowledge of the incidents, but I did over the summer took a trip up into the Pawhuska area because my wife is born and raised in Oklahoma, Ponca City, and we took a trip up there, and did give me a good visual understanding of what that part of the country, that part of the state rather, looks like, even though I didn't see too many of the actual sets. It's like, okay, the rolling hills, it all kind of clicked into place. So when I saw it on the big screen, I'm like, okay, all of this is tracking with what I know, which is not a lot.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit briefly about Martin Scorsese. So again, we're going to talk in depth about what his involvement means for the production, but he's also just a really admired auteur filmmaker. The guy's like over 80 years old. He's been cranking out movies since the 60s. Very highly respected. Let's go around the table, and actually I'll start with you, Sunrise. What is your experience with Scorsese films, and what do you think about him as a director?
I mean, Scorsese is always one of these directors that's just sort of been around. I always have this sort of like, I don't know, list of films and filmmakers that I feel like are just, you're born and then they're just like there. I have no memory of when I started to learn about him. I do remember my first time watching one of his films. I was very young. It was Raging Bull. It was like on, I don't know what. It was probably on Laserdisc, but I didn't understand it. I was like, this,
yeah.
Somehow his name had prestige, but I wasn't matching it to what I saw as like a boring movie that just didn't click to like this, I don't know how, 10 or 11. It's just like it was too mature, both like in the form and the content. And I was like, I don't think this guy's for me. So, but I kept giving it a try. And there was a period where I would confuse Scorsese with Coppola.
Oh,
for all sorts of reasons.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
100% yes.
Yeah. And so like Dracula comes out and I was like, okay, I'll give this guy another try.
Wrong guy.
Yeah, wrong guy. Wrong guy.
But I can see why you think that, because without getting too in the weeds, they were both part of that group of like in the 70s of young up and coming filmmakers. They all came up together: Scorsese, Coppola, Spielberg, George Lucas. Like there was a lot of overlap, and those guys hung out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a very famous picture where they're like having dinner, and that's like one thing that kind of convinced me, because I was definitely like a bigger fan of Lucas and Spielberg, probably for obvious reasons when I was young, and I was like, oh, maybe I should know these other people. But, since then, I've just sort of gotten very used to looking at his work, especially once I got into film school. It's like everybody's talking about Taxi Driver. Everybody's talking about, at that point, people were talking about Last Temptation and the Edith Wharton, Age of Innocence. Yeah. People were talking about that. And my first understanding of him in the theater was Bringing Out the Dead.
Yep.
Yeah. And just it was amazing. And I was like in a minority. I feel like people didn't.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really underappreciated.
It didn't get its due.
It didn't get its due. But I understood it with that film all of a sudden. It had to be the size of the screen, and then all of a sudden I could understand Taxi Driver really because of that movie. I was like, oh, okay, I get what's going on.
Yep.
But since then, I've just followed his career like many people have. He is definitely in a later part of his career. I am definitely more a student of his later period and more an advocate of his later period than the earlier period. And I will die fighting for some of the films that I think people think are not his best works. But like Spielberg, I think he's entered a new period where he's becoming the filmmaker that he's always, the filmmakers he admired when he was younger, what he talks about. I feel like he's gotten there.
He's famously been saying lately, he's been talking about how Kurosawa, he mentioned Kurosawa, how Kurosawa, when he was in his 80s, accepted an Oscar, I think. And he was like, He said, I saw, and he said, I'm so sad because I finally discovered the power of cinema. And he said, at the time, I didn't understand what Kurosawa meant. You're making masterpieces. And he says, with the release of this movie, he's like, I think I finally got it. And there's not enough time. I do not have enough time left on this rock to tell the stories I want to tell.
Yeah, that's definitely, yeah. Like I always quote that statement to students. It's like, don't worry about perfecting. You're not going to master cinema with your first film. You're probably not going to master it with your fifth film or your 10th. Yeah, Kurosawa, almost on his deathbed, makes that statement. He's like, I finally understand what cinema is, but my life is over.
At least he got there.
At least he got there.
He had that moment.
Yeah.
Well, and I've interviewed a lot of artists from different media and, from songwriting, and some of the statements that have come across is that it's very rarely when you're at your most height of popularity that you're doing your best work. That it feels like you're always doing your best work after the time where you were kind of white hot in terms of popularity. And it's amazing the artist and the scope and span of artists that will say that you're very rarely whenever you hit your peak, particularly if you hit it young, 20s, 30s, 40s, like you'll later on write songs or make films whenever you're sort of like lesser known that are way better than that in your opinion, but not as many people hear them or see them.
What about you, Bam? When did you discover Scorsese? Did you discover him when he was white hot?
I discovered him watching Goodfellas way younger than I probably should have. Of course, my dad was very much an advocate of, yeah, sure, watch this movie. I watched a lot of movies I probably shouldn't have with my dad. But yeah, no, I watched Goodfellas when I was, oh my gosh, I probably couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 watching Goodfellas, and it was electric. And so I right away was like, yeah, sure. But there was a lot of things at that. I mean, he did have limits. I mean, there were a lot of things that it's like, no, you cannot watch Taxi Driver and things like that as a 10-year-old.
Sure.
So I didn't, there were a lot of
Just as violent, more sadistic, though.
yeah, there were a lot of connections I didn't make. Like I didn't connect like Age of Innocence. Like the same person directed that as directed Goodfellas. I didn't necessarily always like connect those points. And so it wasn't until I was, college later that I was like, oh, he also did this thing over here. Interesting. And then saw that. So, but I am a pretty big fan of a lot of his later work. And I think it maybe has more value because he's become more set in his values at a time when he's encouraged not to be. And I think that comes about a lot with Killers of the Flower Moon and going to Pawhuska and while they were shooting it and seeing all of the work that was done to like take Pawhuska and turn the clock back on it to, the early 20th century, new awnings on buildings, new storefronts on things, putting dirt down on a stretch of, the main street just down from where the Pioneer Woman's places are, where there's got to be traffic that needs to go there. But we're paying what it takes to do that. And, and casting hundreds of extras, including hundreds of Native American, Osage and other Native American actors to be background in this instead of just hitting a button on a computer to create a crowd or something like that. So I think I've come to admire his work because of some of the principles behind it, which is that, you might use technology to de-age people in The Irishman, but you don't just throw it around whenever you could actually do real filmmaking, kind of thing. And I appreciated that. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about him being the person to adapt Killers of the Flower Moon. I didn't appreciate everything about him being the person to adapt Killers of the Flower Moon by any stretch, but I did appreciate that aspect of it.
Like his dedication to authenticity.
Yes.
As much as possible.
And as much as possible. And that's sort of like, even if it is more expensive to, shut down half of Pawhuska and put up real awnings and put real dirt down and put real Native Americans in 1920s period clothing. That's more expensive, sure, but there's also something worthwhile about that.
Angela, how about you? How long have you been watching Scorsese, or what was your discovery, and how long have you been following his work?
I'm a very casual observer of his work. I think the only one I've ever watched all the way through is Gangs of New York.
Okay.
It's pretty solid.
I'll start him and I'm like, okay. But I do love Gangs of New York. I will watch that all the time. I don't know why. And now thinking about it, you can see a lot of the parallels between something that is as sweeping as Killers of the Flower Moon and Gangs of New York. Everybody with their agenda, well, yada, yada, yada.
But even that one's interesting because it's like he's very proud Italian American. And I think from what I understand, that was his attempt to try to tell the story of that first generation of immigrants and the struggles they had to go through in order to survive on the streets in New York. And it's another one of those, like, the attention to detail and authenticity. Mm-hmm. The movie's not perfect. Harvey Weinstein kind of took a big poo-poo on parts of it, but I still love it. But hey, Laron, you tell me, what is your relationship with Mr. Scorsese?
Like Sunrise, I probably have a much deeper resonance with his later work. You recently did an open-ended question for listeners about what their favorite Scorsese movie is, and mine is actually Silence. And it's a movie I know few people have seen. It made very little movie. They also didn't advertise it, So, but it's one of those movies that resonated with me personally, just dealing with faith and where I'm at with that in my life, and so that resonated with me on a deep level. I think his earlier work, I definitely saw it, but I always saw it as very hyper masculine. Hyper masculine works where I never felt like the women characters in his movies were particularly fleshed out in a way that was, because I grew up in a household mainly with women, and so I always kind of longed to see complex, dimensional women in his stories, and I think that's just not something he was always particularly interested in. I think that Molly Burkhart is one of his best female characters on screen that he's had. Maybe I'll give Sharon Stone, in Casino, she's great in that, so, but in general, just in his stream of body of work, that's normally something I always thought was missing. And here, I think that's something I think he's corrected to some extent, in this particular film, in a way that I think makes the film resonate with me even deeper. But what I have always been aware of is his influence on cinema, because even those films that maybe didn't resonate with me at the time, I could see his influence and his stamp on other movies that I did enjoy, and then kind of retroactively understood where this reference is coming from or who this is from, and so I've always respected him as a filmmaker. So
my story is pretty similar, probably to Sunrise and Laron. So in my childhood, it's George Lucas, it's Steven Spielberg, it's Robert Zemeckis. Teenage me, which again, I'm a millennial, so this will probably make a lot more sense. Zack Snyder, Chris Nolan, the Wachowskis. Okay, there's more, but those are just some highlights. In adulthood, Richard Linklater, really, really, really fan of Rian Johnson, Jordan Peele, and among those people that I just feel like when I watch one of their movies, I walk away with a lot to think about, and sometimes changes the way I look at things. And Martin Scorsese is one of those for me. As far as I'm concerned, he hasn't made a subpar movie since the beginning of the millennium. I'm not saying they're all on the same level of greatness. I think they're all at least good to great. And I definitely agree, Bam, with you and Sunrise. I think his last four, I found out a lot of people don't like The Irishman. I think his last four movies are all like...
I did like The Irishman.
I think all four of them are masterpieces. So he does Wolf of Wall Street, he does Silence, then he does The Irishman, and now Killers of the Flower Moon, tipping my hand a little bit where we're going. But he's just one of those guys, I feel like he's making the very best. Like, his entire life has been building to this chapter where he is really digging into the nature of evil and sin and masculinity and applying it on a very, very deep philosophical, spiritual, and even like systemic level, which we see all those things in this movie. Yeah, I'm a fan. I admire a lot of his older stuff. Temptation of the Christ is another big touchstone for me. And the last thing I'll say is Silence, LeBron. Very deeply personal, spiritual film that I walk out of that movie and I don't think I can ever go. It's like my spiritual journey. There's a lot of chapters to that, but there's a pre-silence, post-silence way I kind of think about God and spirituality and whatnot. So it's one of those big ones. So that said, him tackling this specific story, I was really, really, really curious about what he was going to do. With that said, let's get into our spoiler-free review of Killers of the Flower Moon.
You got nice color skin. What color would you say that is?
My color. The Osage. They have the worst land possible. But they outsmarted everybody. The land had oil on it. Black gold. Money flows freely here now.
I do love that money, sir.
This wealth should come to us. Their time is over. It's just going to be another tragedy.
When this money started coming, we should have known it came with something else.
So, according to IMDb, Killers of the Flower Moon is described as members of the Osage Nation in the United States are murdered under mysterious circumstances in the 1920s, which sparks a major FBI investigation that involves J. Edgar Hoover. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that synopsis is based off of the original script, not the one for the story we watched. So, as we've already noted, this film is based on the 2017 nonfiction novel Killers of the Flower Moon: The Osage Murders and Birth of the FBI by author David Grann, the journalist from the New Yorker, who did a similar treatment for The Lost City of Z: A Tale of Deadly Obsession in the Amazon. As we've noted earlier, the novel investigates a series of murders of wealthy Osage people that took place in Osage County, Oklahoma in the early 1920s after big oil deposits were discovered beneath their land, and the series of murders became so large that it became known as the Osage Reign of Terror amongst the press at the time. Scorsese and DiCaprio were attached to the film in 2017, with production initially expected to begin in early 2018. Following several pushbacks and delays in response due to the COVID-19 pandemic, production was scheduled again to commence in February 2021, with Apple TV Plus confirmed to finance and distribute the film alongside Paramount Pictures. Principal photography ultimately took place in Osage County. So that's right, they actually filmed it where it's set. Whoa. To thunk it these days, in Washington County between the spring and fall of 2021. The reported budget is $200 million, which, you guys can fact check me on this, is the largest amount ever spent on a film that's shot in Oklahoma. So biggest budgeted film we've ever had shot here.
That is true.
Yeah, I would think easily, yeah.
I will also say that when we were on set, so I worked on it just for those who are listening, we talked about it as being the most expensive film on Earth. Until Mission Impossible started shooting.
That's true.
What's the biggest movie that shot in 2021? Because when you think about it, they were still under pandemic restrictions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Tom Cruise is a crazy person in that budget. I mean, I think that production on that shut down like 7 times or something like that, I think.
Yeah. And continues to shut down.
At the box office, it's true. Though I am still going to buy it on 4K. The film reunites Scorsese with several of his most frequent collaborators. So I'm going to go down the line. This is his 6th film with Leonardo DiCaprio, who plays Ernest Burkhart. It is the 10th film with Robert De Niro, who plays William King Hale. It is the 4th film with his director of photography, Rodrigo Prieto. Hope I said that right. Fun fact, he's also the director of photography on Greta Gerwig's Barbie from earlier this year. I think this guy might be getting the Roger Deakins treatment at the Oscars this year. 2 nominations for the price of 1. It is the 11th film with his composer, Robbie Robertson, who tragically passed away 2 months before the film's release, and the film has been dedicated to Robertson. The film also stars the 2 aforementioned collaborators, De Niro and DiCaprio, alongside Lily Gladstone as Molly Burkhart. And this is an actress. We've already talked about her. She appeared at the deadCenter Film Festival earlier this year. We're going to be talking a lot more about her performance here. But he discovered her through Kelly Reichardt's indie darling, Certain Women, which, Laron, you and I hilariously caught that together at MOA.
The Oklahoma Film.
Through.
And she was there for a Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And last but certainly not least, this is Scorsese's 26th feature film as the director. Going to start things going around the table. I'll start with you, Sunrise, then Bam, Angela. Sunrise, what did you think of Killers of the Flower Moon?
So I've seen this 2 7/8 times. I've yet to complete the 3rd, not because I didn't want to. It'll happen, and I'll watch it again probably because I haven't seen it in IMAX yet. But I was conflicted the first time. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I worked on it, and I knew going in that I was going to get distracted by my own memories of the film, which has nothing to do really with the narrative so much as just relationships or space and all these other things. So I knew I had to go see it a second time, so I had to see it. But the first time, it really did affect me on just a personal level related to the material when I was able to sort of push away my own memories. Very affected. In fact, the first time that I see kind of like 3 Osage actors on screen, I like teared up. The fact that they were real Osages playing real characters, and I felt like I didn't know what to do. My body was responding in a way that like I rarely experience. So I had this sort of like overwhelming sensation that like something powerful was happening, because the real tribal members that I feel like some of them I knew, and there's other people that I know in the film, were on screen playing, versions of themselves to some degree. And that was very powerful. I'm like tearing up right now. But that was like one half of the response. The other half was like, I was disappointed in a similar way that I feel like a lot of feedback that I hear from a lot of Indigenous people. And I also sort of like had to kind of like inside tell myself I shouldn't have been fooled into expecting what I kind of expected. And I knew better. I knew better going in. I knew better in so many ways. And so like all those things I was wrestling with in the first viewing. And then the second viewing, which was incomplete, the second viewing came right after watching Fancy Dance. And I was able to like literally, I walked from one theater to the other, and I was able to like think about Lily, and I was more engaged in the material, and I was seeing a lot more of maybe the Scorsese approach and what I feel like is a message. After I sort of like pushed away the things that I felt like were distracting me in the first viewing. And I really sensed a really intricate film that works in a very specific way. And I had to rush to another movie. And then the third time I viewed it that day, I cohered into a clear, I guess, what I felt was like a clear purpose for the film. And I feel like I need to see it again to confirm things for me. But there's a lot of going back and forth.
But it's a whole journey, though. I mean, and there are a lot of emotions that come in, and there's a lot of positive, negative overall.
Yeah,
and you're trying to figure out. So, would you say you're still evaluating it?
I'm still evaluating it. Yeah, absolutely. And I go back and forth, and it's always a constant conversation. Yeah. Especially, like I was at a film festival while I was watching, and it's like all these other films are playing. Everybody's talking about this movie. That's the first thing people talk about. Not the movie in front of them. Not the movie they just saw. We got to talk about this monster. And so that is also like related to this processing.
Yeah.
It'll be... I don't know.
Mike, if we have time, I want to come back to it, doing the comparison between Killers of the Flower Moon and Fancy Dance. And listeners, Fancy Dance is another film. It was made by here in Oklahoma by Indigenous filmmaker.
Yes, Erica Tremblay.
Who we interviewed on this podcast back at deadCenter. Well, hey, thanks, Sunrise, for being willing to be vulnerable and talk about those. And I know it's probably you're still on the journey.
I'm still on the journey. Yeah, I'm still on the journey.
Bam. What did you think of the film?
So for me, writing about the making of films is a big part of my job, and it's always a long game. But this was a particularly long thing. So my thought going into it was, after 7 years of writing about this, is it going to be worth the wait? And it was definitely worth the wait. I've seen it twice. I definitely preferred it in IMAX, although you have to be careful where you sit for that. But I teared up at the end both times. Pretty much cried at the end both times. And I did have that sort of same emotional experience of seeing Osage people. I am not Native myself, but obviously, I cover all arts and entertainment in Oklahoma. And if you cover all arts and entertainment in Oklahoma for 20 years, if you haven't spent a lot of time with Native American people, you're doing it wrong. And I like to think I'm not doing it wrong. So I felt very emotional seeing real Osage people on the screen, on this huge screen, portraying this history that has been related to me so many times and by so many Osage people who've been willing to be vulnerable about it. And so I got emotional about that. I got emotional the first time I really saw a drone shot of the Oklahoma prairie, that yes, they came all the way here and made the movie where it should have been made, that somebody did that. And so I don't have a lot of frustrations with the movie itself. The film itself, I thought, really fulfilled all the things that I wanted it to be. My frustrations with it is just the system that we exist in that allow certain people to make movies and allow certain people to not make movies.
Yeah.
That's really my frustration with it. And I mentioned this in my review because to me it's inescapable. That I really, really, really wanted this story to be told from Molly Burkhart's perspective 100%. And you can't get there under this current system. We talked about this after the IMAX screening. There's 4 or 5 directors on the planet that get to make $200 million movies. All of them are white men. All of them. And I have to give Scorsese credit because 3 of us saw it at the same IMAX screening on the 19th. And what do we see? We see a preview for Napoleon. So many, how many white people get to make, how many filmmakers get to make $200 million historic epics? All white guys. One of them's Ridley Scott. And for the most part, historically, they use it to make stories about other white men. So on one hand, I have to give credit to Scorsese from every report, including talking to the Chief Standing Bear, from every Osage person that I've talked to. He did his absolute best to be as authentic and respectful, and I would even say loving as possible, to tell this story respectfully of the Osage people. Still not Osage. He's still not a woman, and I wouldn't think to speak on behalf of Native Americans, but it's still a frustration to know that he can't get out of his own way a little bit. The story, to me, drags the most when it focuses the most on Ernest Burkhart, but you know it's coming, because you're going to focus on your bankable executive producer, Oscar-winning superstar. At some point, you're going to turn the camera away from Lily Gladstone, and you're going to put it on him, and you're going to put it on him and De Niro and their buddies, all scheming. And to me, the movie loses a little bit. It falters a little bit narratively there, because to me, the true heart of the movie is Molly Burkhart. So I felt that way from... And I had to go into the second screening asking myself, do I feel that way because I'm frustrated because I know there's not a Native American filmmaker on the planet, or an Indigenous filmmaker on the planet, or a woman filmmaker on the planet that they would give $200 million to unless they were making a Marvel movie? I mean, you can be mad about it, Scorsese, but the only women who get to make $200 million movies get to be a Kevin Feige proxy and make a Marvel movie. Only Native American directors or Indigenous directors, African American directors that get $200 million to make a movie don't get to make historical epics. That's just the way it is in the system. And isn't that proof that we've come a really, really long way, but at the same time, kind of not? So I had to go into the second screening thinking, am I frustrated because this is the way the filmmaking is, or am I frustrated because this story really does falter at an hour and a half when we stop seeing what Molly Burkhart's doing? And I came to the conclusion the second time, no, it really does falter narratively there, but then it picks back up. You know, as soon as it shifts back to her, to me, it picks right back up. But there were things that I would have liked the movie to have done, and things that I would like to have seen it addressed if it were truly made from Molly Burkhart's perspective, that you can't do if you have to have Leonardo DiCaprio in a certain number of scenes, and you have to have your fascination with that character, you know, because you can't help being a white man. I mean, I don't blame him for it. I don't blame David Grann for it. I mean, David Grann, I think, has been, it's interesting to me. We've talked about A Pipe for February. Well, there's, you know, Dennis McAuliffe, who was a journalist who's Osage, wrote about, you know, he wrote about the Reign of Terror in 1994. Nobody knows about those books until David Grann, a white man, writes a book about it. And I feel like David Grann's been very generous about both of those books and promoted them and written new forwards for them and all that kind of stuff. But the truth of the matter is, nobody knows about it until a white guy writes about it. And nobody knows this story until a white guy makes a movie about it. And that's frustrating. Yeah. And that's, I know I'm probably spoiler alerting your podcast, but it was part of my review because to me, it's part of the frustration with the film is knowing that as good of the film as it is, and I really, really love the film, knowing that there was a way for it to be that much better if we lived in a system that was a little bit more equitable.
Yeah. I think that's a very, very valid criticism. We're going to dive into that more, especially once we do get to the full spoiler section. But I want to turn it over to you, Angela. What did you think of Killers of the Flower Moon?
I'm like everybody else, very conflicted. I've only seen it once, and so I honestly had to take the weekend to process it. There's a lot of emotions that happen with it, a lot of observations, just, knowing everybody that was involved. I will say that if you're going to be an ally, this is how you be an ally. I think Scorsese really set the bar for allyship. If you're going to be a white guy telling somebody's story, he did the research. And we've talked about that on our podcast, about if you're going to do that, do the research. If you're going to critique our work, do the research. Know which tribe you're going to talk about, because we're not all the same. Mm-hmm. You have to know the intricacies of all of that. And I thought this was an interesting blend of Pipe for February and David Gran's book, because I feel like a lot of the details came from Gran, but a lot of the experience came from Red Corn. Because we've talked about this on Reel Indigenous before, that Indigenous filmmakers have a tendency to make a connection with the space you're in. And they really make it part of the story that we're telling, because we're so rooted to spaces. And like the big drone shot and the car race and, all these big things that really... Even at the end, when you could hear the thunderstorm. Spoiler.
There's a thunderstorm in Oklahoma.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
But I, as an Oklahoman, somebody who was born and raised here, I was like, oh, I feel like I'm here. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm experiencing my own state through the ears, the nose, the eyes of somebody from a different state who came here and really got that sense of space and shared it with us. So I really appreciated that. But yeah, definitely more Molly.
Needs more Molly.
Needs more Molly. It has a lot of, and it does have a lot of Molly. I don't want to make it sound like he doesn't have a lot of Molly in there, but you come a little short, I think, of making her the true heart of the film.
Since we're in the spoiler-free part, I'll just say, needs more Molly.
Yeah. More Molly. Well, that takes it to you, Laron. What did you think of Killers of the Flower Moon?
I feel like I came to this film like a sponge, because there was so much information I did not know about this. And so I think I was fascinated by this history. I was fascinated by... It was a very sobering experience, but also I was very enraged by it because, there's reference to the Tulsa race riots in the story as well. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later in the podcast. So I won't go into grave detail about that. But my connection to the story kind of comes from the history of that, how little I knew of that growing up, and the long-term ramifications. Again, similar story. This idea that there was this wealth and prestige and power and agency that these people had that people identified, and they exploited and they destroyed, and then the long-term ramifications of that, and seeing still how there's this conversation about equity for Black women, or I found a correlation between those histories that made me really lean into this, just as a historical account of a history that's seldom told or known. And so I agree with everyone's sentiment about Molly's character. She's definitely the heart and soul of it, because as you mentioned, anytime she is not on screen, I'm thinking about where is she? What is she doing? How is this particular incident affecting her specifically? which I think is really a true testament to Lily Gladstone's performance, because for her to have a presence even when she's not there, you know, is you know, a big testament to how much she can do with so little. But yeah, I came to this again with a lot of interest, and so it satisfied that for me. I do think there's no one other than Scorsese that could have made the kind of ending that this movie has, and we'll talk about that later too. But specifically, the way the epilogue for this film is very powerful, and it could have been done so many other ways, and as we've seen in a lesser film, you know, where we would have just been seeing text across the screen with "Where are they now?" and what, you know, all that, like, you know, which is just very unimaginative. But he found a very creative way to make that history like hit you, you know, and kind of wash over you. So you are.
I would argue it goes, and we're going to get into the specifics,
Sure.
but I would argue it actually engages with the audience, specifically the white audience, probably more than others. Like,
About the
hey,
complicity of
about
all
the
of
complicity
us.
of what
Yeah.
we're all doing.
What we're all
right?
doing, yeah, and it does it in a very clever, not finger wavy way, but in a way that makes you that does convict you in a certain way, you know. And so, I think it is going to be an important film that has a legacy and longevity, just because of what it's bringing to what attention it's bringing to the story, and I hope it inspires many more three-dimensional, more, you know, told from an Indigenous perspective viewpoint. I don't fault him, as you guys have all said. We've all kind of accounted for the fact that he has done his due diligence in terms of being as authentic as he can about this. But with it, again, it's told from a non-native, based on a book by a non-native, you know, so there's 2 degrees of separation from that perspective, you know. But I do think that it is important that, as I'm saying here in 2023, this is the first that I've known the full scope of this story. And I don't take that for granted, you know, and that is important, and that is of value, you know, because it means millions of people will now know about this history. And if he did it, I would have loved it to have been, you know, a Native American person. But I think that all the same, that it exists, and that people are curious, and that people are interested, and that people are now scouring these books and this history and all this is very important. And I think that is not insignificant.
Well said. Well, there's not a lot left for me to say. You guys have all said it. And what I mean, I just want to echo that. I think agreeing with everything you guys are saying about this is Martin Scorsese. He's not Indigenous. He's not an Oklahoman. He's a prestigious white director from New York. He even has admitted in a bunch of interviews about how he's, air quotes, urban. I'm urban. He was like just wowed that you could still go to like the countryside and horses were roaming, right? Like on the surface, it seems like he's the opposite of the guy who you'd want to tell this story.
Well, and David Grann's a New Yorker as well. I mean,
Right.
so.
Yeah. Yes, again, New Yorker. It's like 2 layers of New Yorker telling the story.
Right.
That said, I think if you can accept that this is the story as told as faithfully as possible by a white guy who has done his homework, an ally who has done his homework, I do think, Laron, to your point, there's a lot of value in what we get. Like, a lot of value. I think, just from, if you're looking just purely at the production, the actual film, I mean, this is several goats, you know, greatest of all times, all collaborating together at the highest level. I mean, yeah, sure, Leo De Niro, Lily Gladstone showing those guys up, which is amazing. But you also have the art direction, the production design.
Yeah.
Robbie Robertson's score is incredible. The costuming, like everything about this production is, well, okay. No, go ahead.
No, I'll talk about it later.
Okay,
Maybe
all
in
right,
spoilers.
Well, there's definitely, you can see the budget on the screen and you can see the work that's put into the craft. And I really admire it for that. And again, I think my take as a white guy is this movie is really not, unfortunately, is really not for the Osage audience. It is trying to amplify the story of the Osage to a wider audience, likely mostly white audience, but I would say globally, to try to raise awareness, Laron, as you already said.
Yeah.
All those things, if you're taking all those things and you're putting it together, my take is third time it really took the third time for me to really like feel pretty confident. I think this thing's a masterpiece because it has utility, because it's telling a story that had not been told, that is raising awareness, because the craft is so great. Now, difference is perfect masterpiece, not the same thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to have cultural significance in the long run. I think it's also the intersection of a bunch of ideas and themes that Scorsese's been working on for his entire career: sin, white privilege, toxic masculinity, faith, corrupt systems, all of it coming together in one story in Oklahoma. So I'm willing to go out on a limb and say it's a masterpiece. I might get crap for that later. So Sunrise, you were shaking your head when we were talking about costumes. So maybe I'll turn it to you.
Oh, not costumes. No, it's my beef is with the score.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, this
okay.
may be taboo and maybe disrespectful. But
No, go ahead.
I don't know how much this has to do with the fact that Robertson passed before the film was finished, and I don't know how complete he felt it was. But it just feels that it's like a few drafts away from a great score. When you compare his other scores with Scorsese, so many of the other scores stand so much taller. And part of it, I think, is the mix. I think it's actually poorly mixed with the score. Like, the score is not as prominent until like maybe mid-film.
It is pretty quiet.
It's pretty quiet. Yeah. And I think there are reasons for that. But I don't walk away from this film with a memory of the score in terms of any themes, the way that I do from The Departed, or the way that I do even from Silence, which uses crickets, and or from The Irishman. Irishman, really incredible score. But this one, it just felt like it just needed more time, I think, both like in the crafting of the compositions, the way that they relate to the material, perhaps the way that they integrate elements of the Osage, but also just the mix. Felt like all those things, perhaps because this is such a massive film with a very specific deadline, this is like the thing that happens. It's also the thing that happens last.
Yeah.
All these elements. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, who knows what his state was on the verge of, his passing. So I feel like the score is perhaps the least refined moments.
Okay, so I was listening to it on the way here.
Yeah, yeah.
And it reminded me of Dead Man.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure, yeah.
And just him
I think that
noodling around with it.
Yeah, I think that some of that's intentional.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So I appreciated it. It is very northern sounding.
It's definitely northern sounding.
He's definitely not.
Yeah, there's sort of a disconnect when it comes to the tribal
he's not immersed
specificity.
in the Osage
right.
tonal ranges at all.
Yeah.
But
it's interesting. I actually left with a stronger perception of the sound design than the score, and just the use of ambient sound from Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I think that I forget. Like, there's scenes where they're inside, like some of those early scenes with DiCaprio and De Niro, where he's kind of giving him the rundown of how things work around here. And they're inside and you can hear the wind. And I think that maybe that's one of the advantages to having somebody who's an outsider come in and look at this, because there were a lot of outsiders who were coming in to Osage country for the first time. And I think that if you're from here, you forget about the wind. Like, I don't think about the wind blowing like it blows every day, because it blows every day like this. I mean, so I think that there were a lot of ambient sounds. Obviously, in the end credits, there's a lot of that's used. Right. But I caught more of like a sense of that a lot of times than I did the score, as how they use the ambient noise of being out in the country in Oklahoma. I actually left with a stronger impression of that until, again, about the midpoint, the score seems to really like wake up a little bit.
Yeah. I do want to say also that the things that you're talking about could have also been considered score. I haven't read anything about this yet, but like when it comes to Silence, the score was considered to be also like the wind, the leaves, the bugs that we're hearing. So that also could have been considered score.
It's a very indigenous
It totally is. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's a more subtle. I will say the third time, the only one that really, there's two kind of motifs that stick with me. Specifically the opening, which is and I was listening to Scorsese in an interview. He was talking about, he's like, I wanted a big, that down now, like with the guitar and everything. But after that, it goes real quiet, just like really subtle every once in a while you hear the guitar just quietly, but it's always there, which is most of the time it's always kind of there.
Yeah, it's always there.
But it's not very prominent. That's a fair point.
Yeah, it's not, and I feel like there's other things that are kind of frequency-wise conflicting with it.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah.
To me, that made it seem like it was contemporary, which it is. I mean, my grandmother was alive during all of this. So to me, it made it feel more contemporary, not a period piece necessarily, but something that just happened.
Yeah, I don't think this is actually a period piece.
No, I agree. I don't think it is at all.
I think it has period detailing, but it's not. It's very contemporary, I think, in the telling of it, which I think is not a bad thing. Somebody who is a newspaper writer who has looked back at the press coverage from that time and also of the Tulsa Race Massacre, it's a good thing that it's contemporary.
Right.
Not to call out my entire industry, although some people in the industry, I mean, we wrote around the Tulsa Race Massacre, we had a story about how the press coverage of that was bad and wrong.
So wrong.
We could write one about that too, for as far as the Osage, because I think this comes through more in Grant's book because of the way it's focused. There was a ton of press coverage about this. There was a ton of press coverage about the Osage in general that fueled all of that envy that we sort of see that comes in to it, because it was all about how these, insert pejorative of Native American here had all this money and were just running around squandering it, whenever the truth of the matter was they weren't squandering it any more than anybody else was during the Roaring 20s that had wealth.
Yeah.
They were not
Absolutely.
squandering it any more than the Marlins and the Phillips and the Gettys
the
of
oil
world
money.
were.
All the,
Right.
Yeah,
other
oil money, right.
Yeah,
oil
anybody
money.
with money.
But all that coverage did. So I think from that perspective of it being contemporary, that is a good thing, because we certainly don't need for it to not be in terms of how it was told. Because if you look back at how it was told at the time, not very journalistically ethical. Let's put it that way.
Well, we have a lot to hit on, so I do want to dig into a little bit. Angel, I'll start with you on this. I mean, how well do you think the Osage and Indigenous people were represented? It sounds like you and Sunrise both had some sort of a reaction watching it. Like, how well did you think they repped on the big screen?
I liked how light everything was when they were showing them and their ways of life and the things that they were doing, and it was bright. And it was sunny, and of course the clothes were 100% accurate, and as they can be on film. And I think that, like I said, he went above and beyond with his allyship in working with them. That being said, many of the consultants were interviewed after the debut, and they agreed it is not a film for the Osage. He kind of speeds through this beautiful life that they have, which it kind of hits some of the high points. And then we spend a lot of time otherwise. We're still in spoiler free, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Still spoiler free. So you're referencing, like, at the beginning, how we get like this montage at the beginning of, like, look how great they've got it.
Well, I mean, the colors were, the lighting on set was bright and sunny, and everybody was smiling and moving happily about, and everything was great on the surface. And so I think that for the time, it was very accurate from what I know. Of course, I'm not Osage, but it seemed like he talked to enough people who would know that it would be on point.
Yeah. Sunrise, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I reiterate some of those things. I agree with a lot of those things. My emotional reaction was to how he was able to capture natives, like specifically to the United States, just giving them an opportunity to be on screen, and how much time was given to them, both like in terms of like the prep, like all the money and the time spent to dress them and to do the hair and makeup, and then how much time we spend shooting and how much time we spend with them in the film. It's not enough, but I would say that anybody besides him, I feel like probably would not do the service of spending so much time with these individuals. And Yeah, and there's moments where we get characters that are, you know, not even tertiary characters, and we spend a lot more time with them than we would in another filmmaker's films. So for somebody who's non-Indigenous to give that amount of time in this tremendously large budgeted production when he could be spending more time on Leo, and that's not to say that he spends enough time with these people over Leo. But the fact that he did is really incredible. And that, in addition to how he's capturing these individuals, is very communal. It's not an individual. There are very few close-ups of the indigenous people. One of my favorite scenes is when all the sisters are laying down on the blanket and they're talking with each other and sort of like comparing the men to animals and talking about their intimacy and teasing each other. It's like shots that are in multiplicity. And I feel like that is his attention to things that I think are very indigenous. We talk all the time about how like indigenous narratives are about community, and that's reinforced, you know, by contemporary filmmakers. Sterling is an example where the whole Reservation Dogs series is about a community. It's not about an individual. And he's able to capture that. And I felt like that was something that was really impressive to me, especially that like we start that way. We start with the community in the like the immediate scene where we're introduced to the nation. And then as it moves forward, it continues to apply that to some degree. So I thought that was really incredible. Related to what I think is the purpose of the film, which I'm going to talk about more in spoilers, but there's the way that he affords the nation time, not just in like scenes of like daily life, but also like related to politics and decision making and related to the narrative progression, and the larger maybe message. I feel like he also did some amazing work. We hear and spend time with these individuals in a way that I feel like I don't see in other historical representations, quote unquote historical.
Yeah, he really moves away from the pan-Indian approach.
Yeah, totally.
Which is what we fight against all the time.
Just to clarify, when we say pan-Indian, for listeners who might not be familiar, what are you referring to?
When you're watching the old westerns, TV shows, movies, they're just the savages,
right?
Just the Indians. There's not a specific.
Yeah, they conflate tribal details like teepees, the wardrobe.
Right.
Yeah,
It's a monolith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a pan-Indian approach, which Reservation Dogs is in this are a great example of people asking me, "Oh, is this really true?" And me being able to say, "You know what? That's not my nation, but I'm glad you asked that, so that I can explain how we're different."
Yeah.
There was one I was watching. I think it was on Jimmy Kimmel. Gosh, I watched so many freaking interviews with Scorsese. But he was saying there was a scene. I want to say it was the scene where they're this in a communal setting. They're discussing, hey, these murders are happening, and they're going to send this guy to Washington to
bingo. Yeah.
Or as I like to call it, it's the scene where Robert De Niro is the hot dog costume meme, literally in the scene. We got to find the guy who did this. I'll pay you $1,000. I guess Scorsese at one point let them just start riffing.
Yeah.
They just started going, and it wasn't scripted. And he's like,
Yes.
I could tell.
You could totally tell.
When that
You know when that happens.
Yeah.
And immediately in the movie, this is why I'm like, this is not historical epic. This is, you go to the tribal meetings. In fact, like there's a documentary with like the same individuals and the same things happening. And I'm just like, this is, they just let them go.
Yeah.
And good for you. And good, like there's a moment, maybe I'll get into spoilers, but there's a moment earlier where we set up the scenario of like duration and time and listening, and I think it's related to that. And I think he's learning. Scorsese, I felt like was learning the way in which to participate in this community, like how you engage in communication, and he applied it in the film in terms of the cutting, in terms of the duration, in this process of like just letting them go.
Yeah, especially when it comes to elders.
Yeah, absolutely. One last thing that's related to this sort of like composition that accommodates multiple people. I'm starting to see this as part of indigenous filmmaking, maybe specifically to America. But when you have a wide frame and you have a lot of people in the shot, and the fact that we've got real people in this shot, and he's casting real people and people from Oklahoma, there's this amazing thing that happens both in this film and a lot of indigenous media, particularly like Reservation Dogs, the audience is able to go, I know that person. Like literally
It's
sometimes.
very relatable.
Very, very relatable. It's like, I know that person. That's exactly this person in my family or my cousin or my friend. Sometimes it's literal. It's like, in the screening, the first one, Maya and I were like pointing out people that we literally knew. Yeah. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's a celebration of the fact that people are alive and we're seeing the reality of those people on the screen. It is amazing. In that particular scene.
Well, I want to turn things over to you, Bam, for a second. You have been covering Oklahoma entertainment arts for a very long time.
Sure.
How did you think Oklahoma was represented in this specific film?
Are you talking about Oklahoma or the Osage?
Oklahoma.
Before I say that, I do want to say something about how the Osage were. One of the things that I appreciated the most about the film and all of the effort that was put into it, and this is speaking as a non-native but still as somebody who works a lot with natives, is that how much of the language was featured in the film, how much of the Osage language was in there. Because I don't know if you remember, I actually was just Googling the date. So when Wes Studi was on the Oscars in 2018 and he spoke Cherokee, the Cherokees were like, that's the first time that our language has been on national television ever. And that was 2018.
Yeah.
So to have a major Hollywood motion picture come out that has Osage throughout, and actually there's probably more Osage than English spoken maybe in the first hour. I mean, it's probably pretty close division. That to me I thought was amazing to see that there's just in 5 years you've gone from a sentence being spoken in Cherokee on the Oscars being the most anybody's ever heard of a native language to a film that's 3.5 hours long that a big chunk of it is in Osage, and a lot of it is without subtitles. And a lot of times Scorsese, in some of the interviews, he said we didn't need them. You can tell what people are saying.
Yeah,
Or
totally.
you can at least get the gist of what they're, I mean, if Lily and Leo are arguing, they're arguing. You can tell. You don't need to know the exact detail of what they're whispering in Osage. You know that they're arguing over, whatever. And so I thought, to me, that was something that was so vital to it. And it just, after working with so many Native people and hearing so often the big complaint about being treated as a monolith, like every tribe is the same, every Native person is the same. It was great to see, even if I found limitations to it, that people were treated as individuals. Like there is a woman in Molly's family who is an alcoholic, but not every Indian's a drunk Indian. That's nice because, and what we see in old Hollywood movies, every Indian's a drunk Indian, every Indian's comic relief, kind of thing. And so it was nice to sort of see that individualism in characters, even like smaller characters like Henry Roan, where you sort of get he's not a main character, but he's a supporting character, but you get kind of a well-rounded sense of who he is a little bit. And so to me, I did appreciate that. As far as how Oklahoma, is depicted, we look great. The landscape.
$200 million looks
the
great.
landscape looks awesome. What can you say? I feel like the people that we had that worked on it, which obviously were not like the above the line people and things like that. But the ones that we had that worked on it, I think did great work. I don't think that there's any question about how good of a job the cast and crew did. I don't think there's any question as to how well the Osage artisans and costumers and language consultants and all those people, I don't think there's any question that they did great work. It's a horrible piece of Oklahoma history. I don't know what to say except for that. One thing that you can take from it is that I did speak to Yancey Redcorn, who plays the chief in the film, just a couple days before the actor strike. I spoke to him, and he had gone to the Cannes premiere, and he commented that the most memorable thing about the Cannes premiere was the number of people who were actors and directors from other countries who approached him after the next day to say, I know that was about your people, but that was about me and my family's history in Africa or Indonesia or Thailand. And so I guess Oklahoma can take solace in the fact that we're hardly the only ones who have this type of history. Maybe it's just more concentrated because we were Indian territory. But, it's a horrible chapter of Oklahoma history. And that it runs parallel with the Tulsa Race Massacre is bad, but the Tulsa Race Massacre is hardly, that whole summer was the Red Summer, where there were race massacres that happened like that all over the country. So I mean,
There's so many more we
there's-
have that even like that's
Yeah.
gotten attention, but there's more.
there's more that haven't
happened.
gotten attention, right? And so, I mean, I think that it's one of those things that, I mean, it looks beautiful, it sounds beautiful. The people who worked on it, who are from Oklahoma, did fantastic work. I think we certainly showed that, you know, you could make a $200 million movie in Oklahoma, but it's sad that you have history like that in Oklahoma. But that history, I think, exists everywhere. And I mean, I think that if there's one thing that can really have utility, like you say, is that there's a relatability to it that, I mean, I think we've seen it done really well globally. I mean, I think some people are surprised at how well the box office has done globally so far. I think people relate to the story of an indigenous people being exploited by whites who come in from the outside. That is not a story unique to Oklahoma. It's just this story is, excuse me, maybe, sorry about that, maybe unique in its scope, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe they learned a lesson from Prey that was released on streaming only.
Yeah.
Until I bought the 4K just a couple weeks ago.
Finally did come out. Came out on.
But yeah, it didn't get
But
a
it didn't
theatrical.
get a
release.
No, it did not get
release.
theatrical. Sad, tragically.
Yeah.
That movie should have been on the big
It
screen.
should have been on the big screen. So
Yeah.
maybe they took a little tiny clue from
And I
that.
prefer is it Comanche?
Yes.
Yes. I
Yeah.
prefer,
Oh, yeah.
I prefer
Oh,
that
yeah.
version. Like
It's so
I
much
watched
better.
both
Yes.
just to get
Oh,
a
yeah.
comparison, but it far exceeds hearing it in the native. I
Easily.
mean, and like you said, we don't know everything that's happening, but like
But you
can
do.
interpret a lot of information from people's emotions. Just like language is body language is also communicating a lot of things. You know.
But I think you're seeing a sea change to not only just native and indigenous creators getting to tell their own stories, which I think is extremely important. Although I still think that we're seeing it largely in a more independent scale than we're seeing it on a big budget scale for sure. But I also think too that you're seeing a change in attitude. Whenever I talked to people who from Oklahoma, from the Pawnee Nation, who were consultants on the Amazon series, The English, that came out late last year, which is excellent and that everybody of age should watch. They talked about how there was it felt different this time. It wasn't just, we have this that we're doing and we want you to rubber stamp it. It's, we want to use Pawnee in these scenes, and how would you say this in Pawnee, and like really tell us how to do it and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, they were working long distance because it was being filmed in Spain during the pandemic, but you know, it was, they said that there was much more engagement, much less just hit okay and tell us that we can do this because this is what we're doing and we want to be able to put that we had Pawnee consultants. It was more like, this is how we want to tell this story. And it's like, if you say, well, no, that wouldn't have happened this way, they say, oh, okay. And then they come back a few days later with new pages. You know, so I'm hoping that this is setting that new standard for if you're going to tell an indigenous story as a non-indigenous person, this is the level of what you're expected to deliver.
And audiences will buy it. I just want to, I know it's not indigenous story, but I do want to call out, just thinking about different languages or subtitles, like Parasite did win Best Picture in 2020. So I think audiences in general, if you trust them, they'll get it, you know? I don't know. Sunrise, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just comparing these two films, Killers and Prey, there is a very specific distinction that I think is really important to consider. And that Killers, it's great that Scorsese went through the effort that he did, and we're all recognizing the effort and the outcome. But Prey is very distinct because we have somebody that's above the line, that's indigenous, that's having a very clear influence, right? So like somebody that's a producer helping make decisions and helping relate the audience and the subject matter and the people that are working that are indigenous on the influence of the outcome, narrative structure, the way it's distributed, the language, all those things came from somebody who was above the line. Killers, well, I feel like only got so far, and I feel like it's reached a certain ceiling that Prey sort of outpaced it to some degree, and that's probably the bar maybe when it comes to in integrating an individual that's of a community.
Yeah.
Was there a member of an Osage who could have been an executive producer?
Right.
Instead
Yeah.
of Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Leo probably still would be an executive producer. There's no way that
Yeah.
movie
Well,
would
listen,
get made
we
without
all
it,
know
but-
there's actually no limit to the number of executive
Yeah,
producers.
you
Right, yeah.
There's a limit that number of who can accept an Oscar, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Well, so much more to talk about with Oklahoma, but unfortunately, to make sure we have time to get to the spoilers, I do want to talk about two elements that I know are just generally being discussed about this film out there that are different than the content, which is the runtime. Brandy, bam! I saw that you published the article about when to take a pee break, restroom break during Killers of the Flower Moon.
I did not use the word pee.
You did? Oh, sorry, I know. My potty mouth got in the way.
Well, there also is a Run P website, and I would never want to infringe on somebody else's IP. I have respect for other people's, even though I don't think you can trademark the idea of running and peeing, but I mean, still, I like to steer clear of stepping on other people's territory, I guess.
I just want to know, I want to turn this one back to you first, only because a couple of reasons. Number one, you wrote that article. Number two, you are among one of the harshest critics I know of long run times. And I have to know, did the 3.5 hour movie work for you?
It did. I did say that I will say it worked to a certain extent. There is, I think I mentioned this in the story, which by the way, that story was hilarious because it was an online editor kind of thing that would be like, hey, if you could do this, people will be looking for this information and we will get 1 million hits off of it. And I'm like, do I really want to, from an artistic perspective, encourage people to leave the film? I mean, that's just not normally what I would do. But the funniest thing about it is that there were a whole bunch of filmmakers who were like, thank you for that.
I saw the comments.
Some of the people who commented on it were filmmakers who were like, I appreciate this information. I'm like, really? Filmmakers appreciate me telling when to leave a film to go to the bathroom? I was like, because I guess if you got to go, you got to go. I mean, it's 3.5 hours. For the most part, yes, the runtime worked for me. I tend to, maybe I was a little overly empathetic this time, having to have sat down and written more than once now about the Osage Reign of Terror and had to explain what headrights are and all those kind of things. I mean, I feel a little bit better about some of those 2,500 inch stories that I turned in that an editor was like, really? 2,500 words? This is ridiculous. It's like, well, just you try to explain it. I mean, I felt a little bit better about some of those stories whenever I was like, well, it took Martin Scorsese 3.5 hours to tell it, and he only told part of it. So there. So, I mean, maybe I felt a little bit of empathy toward Martin that I maybe don't feel about everybody else that turns in a 3.5 hour movie that I'm like, oh my gosh, could you not cut one chase scene or some sort of explosion to at least make it easier on my back here? Come on. But yeah, I tend to be very harsh critic about that. But I will say that there is, again, to a certain extent, it works for me because I will never stop saying that there's that whole bit between an hour and a half and about 5 minutes till the 2 hour mark where it's like, do we really need to see another henchman talking to Martin Scorsese about how evil they're being? Can we just get back to whatever Molly's doing? That was the part where I was like, yeah, go to the bathroom there. You can. It's a good time. So yeah, not every scene I think was perfect. There were some scenes that I think could have been trimmed, and I don't necessarily think we need more henchmen to get major screen time, even if they're played by Peter Yorn. But yeah, for the most part, I was digging the 3.5 hour runtime, and he surprised me because I thought with The Irishman, I thought, oh God, do I really have to? I love you, Scorsese, but do I really have to sit here for 3.5 hours? And then I watched it and I was like, yes, that was worth my 3.5 hours. And that was my conclusion with the review too, that it was worth your 7-year wait and it was worth your 3.5 hours to sit through Killers of the Flower Moon. It was a worthwhile experience.
I can't believe that she just said that. I don't know about you.
Now I've gone to see, how many hours does that add up? 7 hours of Martin Scorsese.
I watched 10. I'm at 10 and a half. Oh my gosh. Laron, Chapman, how about you? Did the runtime work for you?
You know, it's interesting. I had the same argument. I think I saw Caleb's eyes roll several times ahead of this process. When I mentioned also that I was dreading the length of this movie. I was just like, do we need that much time for any movie, really? I mean, and to be fair, I think if it warrants it, yes. And for me, to my surprise, also, I mean, it's not. I'm kind of coming down on the sentiment that I've heard a lot that it just flies by. I don't think that, but I do think that it's not that there's no time. It took no time. It's just that I felt like the time that I viewed the film, it wasn't wasted. You know what I mean? Or it was utilized, as it, well, so from a narrative standpoint, so I think that the scope and and magnitude of this history and story that's kind of specific to this region. You know, it just feels so like there's still so much to learn about it, even with what we've seen, you know. So I think it did warrant it. And I think as a film, like I think people think 3.5 hours and they think boring. It's going to be boring. Right. And it's not boring. I'll give you that. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't suffer for me, at least for pacing issues. There are perspectives I would have liked to have seen more of, but as a film, I think it flows well. Yes, I think it's economical in the choices that it makes along the way. So,
well, and nobody's better than Scorsese at like taking these sort of like long stretches of things. Either they're peaceful or they sort of lull you because they've gone on for a minute, and then there's these like flashes of like violence, or there's these things like that are all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, where'd that come from?
Yeah, you're comfortable and you're settled, and then all of a sudden you're gripped.
Somebody's getting stabbed.
It's gripping, you know. So yeah,
right. Angela, did the runtime work for you?
I thought it was fine. I do warn people that ask me that are familiar with the story that like the first half is exposition for us, just because we're more familiar with the story. And so I'm like, yeah, you know, if you're gonna make a trip to the bathroom or to go get your concessions, we're a lot more familiar with this part than we are this part. So, but I think the runtime was fine. I didn't notice it being overly long.
Yeah. Sunrise?
Like I mentioned earlier, I think that the runtime has a very specific purpose when it relates to what I think is the message of the film. I think there's several messages related to the length, but I feel like the length is commenting about the perspective of the Osage, number one, what it means to have the patience an Indigenous person is supposed to have when someone is giving them information. And this usually comes in the context of like an elder. And Angela's laughing because
sorry, because it's so true.
Elders.
That's totally my dad.
Yeah, elders take a lot of time, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. A lot of that, I think, has to do with Indigenous processing. If it takes a lot of time for information to come out, you're considering the words a little bit more.
Yeah,
you're thinking about how it relates. Yeah, so I feel like that is part of what happens, and I think he explicates that experience for the audience. Whether people get it or not, I think is up for debate. Whether it's effective is up for debate, but I think that's a reason for the way that shots linger and the film is longer. But also, I think it also has the runtime relates a little bit to what I think he's sort of alluding to about these two different cultures. I've alluded to one. The other is really related to spoilers for me, but I feel like it's making a comment about America, I think. Yeah. So I think there's a symbolic purpose. The same thing with like The Irishman. I think really there's amount of duration that relates to like the character, I think.
My thought, and I thank you for sharing that. I'm a big fan of using form to communicate a message, which is almost like a lost art these days, especially when you try to explain to people that no, there's an intentionality behind how it's being delivered to you on the screen. It brings me to think I loved it because it allowed us to really live and breathe in these moments with all the characters. It's like you could have, if you just wanted to focus on the plot and even the major character beats, you could have cut out a whole hour easy. But you wouldn't have that investment in those characters. You wouldn't feel like you're living in that part of Oklahoma in the 1920s in the way you did. And
Lily Gladstone would have got even less screen time.
Exactly. Which, by the way,
not in my universe.
But by the way, again, incredible performance. She doesn't have to say very much. The long silences following her deliveries sometimes are some of the best moments in the whole movie.
I agree.
And again, if you're just focused on the way we're I think mainstream audiences are used to like edit, action, move, pace, go fast. The pace here is different. It's more meticulous. It's more intentional. And I think everything that's here serves a purpose. Third time, I can't believe I really thought it was going to get worse every time I watched it. But the third time it really clicked. I was like, no, I am on this ride. And now that I know it's coming, I'm able to like really soak it in and not wondering, what's going to happen next. I'm like, okay, I'm really taking in this scene and how it fits into this larger story and in that way. And I'm catching details. it took me to the third time. I can't believe I didn't notice this on the first time. There's a character who's a side character, but Molly has to go visit him to get money. Third time, took me the third time to figure out there's a giant KKK like poster right behind him.
Oh, right, yeah.
You know, and that's like a small, minute detail, but it's important.
Yeah,
and it took me that's how many views it took me to catch those details. And because the scenes last long, you can really do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have to say I'm really glad this is an epic, not necessarily in the terms of we think of epic in the blockbuster. There's giant set pieces and whatnot, but it's epic in the sprawling story it's telling, how big in scope it is. It's also able to be very, very intimate, I think.
And I think that to the point about the exposition, especially in the beginning, I really appreciate it as somebody who's had to write about the history before, just that we were dealing with kind of a master cinematic craftsman in that it wasn't a big bunch of blocks on the screen of like, this is what happened, where, you know, all this kind of stuff, or that it wasn't at the end, this is what happened after everything was, that it was folded into the narrative and folded into the storytelling as masterfully it was. I really appreciated, because I was like, please don't start out with some dry thing about this is a headwrite. This is what a headwrite is, because it's like, having written those kinds of stories before, you have to think, oh my gosh, I just put everybody to sleep at paragraph 3, so nobody even got to the Reign of Terror part. I appreciated how masterfully the exposition was done. But it is exposition heavy, but
only for those that are familiar with it. I
Right.
mean, it's necessary for those that are not.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think even then it's setting I'm not going to disagree with the exposition, but it really sets the tone. Another thing that stuck out to me on the third viewing was, and actually my wife was the one who said something to me about this, and I was like, I didn't think about it. That first scene where you kind of like entering the city, and you just see all how high living the Osage people are, how loud and rambunctious it is, and something she pointed out to me, and I was like, that is really profound. And it took third time, and you don't get these details when you're flashing. It's really loud because the white people are making tons of noise, and in fact, Molly is trying to like. She's like, this is too much. She's trying to quiet. And it's like just an interesting inverse from the stereotype that we've been fed, especially white audience has been fed in terms of like Westerns.
What is
air
the
quote,
line?
Air quote, savages.
Something to the effect of like, do you have a card in this race?
Right.
You know, something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
Then let's
Let's
going.
go. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
So yeah, master craftsman, being able to see it work. Well, we are running short on time, but let's just really quick, thumbs up, thumbs down. IMAX, recommend IMAX, Bam?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do. Now, I did have Lee McCormick, who is, I think you may know her. She's actually a native actor and designer from here in Oklahoma. She said be very careful about where you pick to sit in the IMAX, because there is so much going on. She sat very close and very much in the front and didn't feel like she could see as much. So choose your seats carefully, because you are dealing with something that's a very wide scope of things.
J22 or J21.
Yep. That's right.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
I think we sat in H.
Kindred
We
spirits.
sat in H. We sat in the row, the one there's a bit in the Quail Springs. It's like dead in the center, but it's closer to the back. Yeah, by
And
like
it was
one row.
pretty perfect.
Yeah. Sunrise sounds like
I did not see it in IMAX. I'm a big advocate of IMAX, but where I was watching and I had no access to IMAX. So Yep.
bummer. Angela?
Same, no access to. Because I jumped on a plane the next day.
That's
Oh,
right.
it's
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
She gets a pass.
I've seen it once, and it was in IMAX, and I have nothing to compare it to, but I can say that watching it in IMAX, I did feel like I got a lot of information, maybe too much information to process, even scene to scene, because of everything that's happening in the background. You could see things if you could wander and look over here and not pay attention to what's on the screen, and there's still a lot of information being conveyed, which goes to how much detail went into creating this world, you know. So I think it's probably the optimal way to watch it.
Yeah, so I saw it at a press screening in a standard definition theater. And press screenings are tough because I swear a lot of the time they do not have the audio mix correct. Cause they haven't screened it for other audiences at that point. So I definitely preferred the IMAX, largely because, yes, the bigger screen is always better. But largely for the sound mix was light years better than the first standard viewing that I watched. The third time I also watched it standard, but it was in the Cinemark XD, which is not IMAX, but it's their kind of the closest they get to IMAX, I guess. And it was very good. So highly recommend the premium price for the tickets on this one. All right, Laron, we're going to have to save this for a follow-up on in terms of the Oscar discussion because there's so much to talk about there, and I want to talk all the meaty stuff and spoilers here. What letter grade would you give Killers of the Flower Moon? So, Laron, I'll start with you.
I'd like to see it again. I think I'm sitting at an A- right now. I think it's not a 5-star film for me, but it's a very worthy 4.5-star film for me. So, and I think that could change upon different viewings, but it's definitely a very sobering and impactful film, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since I've watched it. So I know that it's that there's some cultural significance there.
Yeah, awesome. Well said, Angela.
After one viewing, I would say B.
B. Nice. Fair. Sunrise.
I have 2 letter grades. If this were an Indigenous film, which is not, I'd give it a D+. But because he's an American filmmaker, and specifically an American genre filmmaker, I give it a B+. And it just loses some points because it's not including the just perspective as much, which is included in the American experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. I think it's good criticism. Bam.
For the film itself, again, similarly, taking it out of the paradigm that it had to be made by the people it had to be made because of the world we live in. Just evaluating the film itself, I give it an A-.
I'm going to go A+, specifically because the third time, the movie we got from the perspective we got it from for the audience it was intended for. I really think it's a home run. Now, again, as we're going to talk about even more in-depth in spoilers, there's a whole host of, but was he the guy to make this? Should he have made this movie? What's missing because he's the guy who made the movie? You know, there's all these other things that we need to talk about in terms of yes, it's a great, I argue, a masterpiece, but is it the masterpiece that this story, was this the version of the story that needed to be told, essentially? So what we got, I think, is great, but maybe we needed something different. Just saying. Before we go into spoiler section, I do like to do a quick round of recommendations for people who like Killers of the Flower Moon or have, hey, you like it? What's something else you should watch? So Sunrise, I'll start with you on this one.
Well, one thing I didn't mention about Scorsese is that he's just a cinephile, and that's something that really sort of spawned my interest in cinema. And if you're interested in things that he is interested in, I would suggest very important text. That's a very academic way to think about it, but I would say Marcel Carné's film *The Children of Paradise*, really influential on Scorsese, particularly when it comes to gangs of New York and this particular film. In fact, he sort of recreates sequences from this particular movie. But he's very influenced by so much cinema that I can't also discount Visconti and the film called *The Leopard*, or Robert Bresson's film *The Trial of Joan of Arc*, or Hitchcock's film *The Wrong Man*. If you're interested in Scorsese and his filmmaking, all those films are influencing a lot of his work in his later films, but this one in specific, that's just if you're interested in cinema and Scorsese. If you're interested in the film and the narrative, I would suggest you look at a film called *The Osage Murders* by David Bishop. It's a documentary. And it addresses the same narrative, more ingrained from the perspective of the Osage. In fact, we see the same people in the film as we do on the screen. So that's what I suggest.
All right. Brandy?
I really recommend, actually, after having this, I have not seen it yet. So after sitting on this podcast, I'm definitely going to try and see Silence. I think it's just one that I missed when it came out. And so probably because it was 3 hours or something like that, and I decided
it was only 2.5. Only 2.5.
I didn't have enough time for it. I definitely think that people should see The Irishman because I think that it's a very interesting film to watch as almost like a bookend to this one. I think it's very interesting to see that sort of storytelling style that he crafted out of that story applied to this. I definitely think that people, if you love Lily Gladstone, which you should. When you see this film, A Certain Woman is great. I think that seeking out Fancy Dance, whenever hopefully, I'm really, really hopeful, and I know Lily is, and I know that Erica Tremblay was, that this will help Fancy Dance land distribution and be able to be more widely seen than it just has been on the festival circuit. Because I think that you really see what she can do whenever there's a female Indigenous storyteller who's getting to tell the story. Yep. And I also just think that I'm never going to stop recommending The the English to people, because I think it's a very interesting story. It's a different time period, but I think it's a very interesting storytelling perspective from a different time period of this sort of these clashes of cultures. I think where the perspective is.
This is on Prime with
Emily Blunt.
Emily Blunt. Yes.
Emily Blunt.
Yes, it's on my queue. I'm very curious to watch it.
Chesky Spencer.
And
Chesky
Chesky Spencer, who is excellent.
Amazing in it.
And so I definitely and then I'm always going to recommend Reservation Dogs, because if you want to see what happens whenever you actually and basically any of Sterling Harjo's films, if you want to actually see what happens whenever you I pick Reservation Dogs because there's more of a budget there. But if you ever want to see what happens whenever you actually give a Native American filmmaker free reign to actually tell a story from his community, it's wonderment. And so I just feel like everybody should see Reservation Dogs.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's super funny, great characters, great drama. But the humor, the blending of humor and drama throughout. I love those characters. It's so good. Angela, what would you recommend to listeners?
I'm a reader, so I would definitely recommend A Pipe for February or Mean Spirit if you want to look more at the Osage murders. So,
All right. Yeah, good. Frankly, we probably need more reading recommendations. There's like you and my friend Chad and a couple other people that'll always do reading.
Do books, yeah.
So thank you for that.
For sure.
Laron Chapman.
Well, I'm starting my early campaign to get Lily Gladstone a gold trophy next year. So I'm also going to double down and echo the sentiments about Fancy Dance. But in particular, I mean, I became known of her from Certain Women, which I think Martin Scorsese did too as well. I think he mentioned that in an interview. And I remember watching that film, and I feel like she ran away with the entire movie. That third chapter of that movie, I think, is incredible and very similar to her performance in Killers. Very quiet, understated, but her face is a map of the world.
And again, acting against people who are
well known,
Yeah.
have presence in
Master of the form.
Yes.
master of form, and here she is, and I'm like, cannot take my eyes off of her because, again, without saying anything, there's just so much information being conveyed, and I think that those kind of nuanced, restrained performances just don't get enough attention. They always go for the loud, big, showy one. I'm like, but listen to the quiet girl in the corner. You know what I mean? Like she's the most interesting part of that film and this film. So,
Well, you all have pretty much said all my recommendations. I have a couple other ones. You took the best ones. I would add, in terms of the Lily Gladstone, please distribute this, Quantum Cowboys, which was also a deadCenter. That actually was low key. I mean, Fancy Dance was incredible, but in terms of my wheelhouse, like in terms of the weird sci-fi animation styles, I loved that movie. So all of those films get picked up, and audiences seek it out. Quantum Cowboys, seek it out so I can get the second and third ones they've already got planned. So please, let's go. Yeah. I don't even know how to pitch the film. I don't even know how to pitch the film. Just look up
Lily Gladstone. Look at her.
Look at Lily Gladstone, Quantum Cowboys.
Gladstone films.
I'll link it, but like Quantum Cowboys.
Physics.
Yeah, intermixed with various animation styles set in the Old West. Yeah,
Sort of.
Kind of. Yeah, exactly. Sort of.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Ambiguous. Yes. Old West.
Two other things I'd add. Just give a shout out to HBO's Watchmen, only because in terms of how Tulsa has been portrayed on either the big or the small screen, there's not a lot of great examples of that. You don't have to watch the whole show. I mean, the whole show is great, but I think if you, the opening 15 minutes, I think really displays the Tulsa angle pretty true to form before you get into all the superhero stuff, sci-fi stuff later. Also, not about Indigenous necessarily, but there will be blood. A lot of people getting exploited for oil money. With that said, that concludes our spoiler-free section, and we're going to jump into the spoiler discussion. So if you do not want to be spoiled on Killers of the Flower Moon, go ahead and tune out now.
You know what? I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving.
I'm not fucking leaving. The show goes on.
So I want to start. This is the thing we've been dancing around this whole conversation. Whose story is this to tell? And I also want to talk a little bit about how Scorsese's point of view shapes the narrative. example for you, the listener, before we get into the details. This film originally had Leonardo DiCaprio starring as Tom White, the FBI agent who was played by Jesse Plemons in the film. And the original script placed a much larger emphasis on how the FBI was formed. However, during, I think it was either right before or at the very beginning of the pandemic, DiCaprio and Scorsese had a talk, and DiCaprio basically was like, yeah, we're really not getting to the heart of the film. I want to play Ernest. At that point, they rewrite the entire film. Scorsese and the other co-writer,
Eric Roth.
Eric Roth, thank you, had Roth there. And that's when they put Ernest and Molly, Lily Gladstone, front and center of the story. So there's been a lot of discussion around the question: is Scorsese the guy? He did receive initial blessing and eventually praise from the Osage Chief Standing Bear, as Bam's already noted. But I want to start. I just want to start this part of the conversation off as, why is that an important question to ask? And I know that might seem obvious to those of us around the table, but for a lot of listeners out there who are more casual with their film going or their media, it's really important to ask the question: why is this person the main character? Why is the writer-director putting this person at the center? So with that, Sunrise, I'll start with you. Why do you think this is an important question to consider when we're watching, processing, and ultimately forming ideas and opinions based on Killers of the Flower Moon?
Well, the history of storytelling and media making has been overtaken by one particular perspective. And that's not to over-homogenize, but for the most part, storytelling has been dominated by white, cis males. And that's not to say that they don't have perspectives or that they don't have something to say or that it's not valid, but it's a monopoly. It's been a monopoly on most storytelling, and most storytelling that's been widely distributed. So that means that all other perspectives that are not that gender orientation background have not had the same equitable amount of time to share their perspective, even if it's the same event. So that means that there's a lot of progress that needs to be made to make an equitable amount of storytelling from other perspectives other than that one. And again, I reiterate that it's not to eliminate that perspective. That perspective has its own valid positioning, but it is inequitable. Right. So, it's helpful to have another individual say, I saw it from this perspective, right? I mean, that's what we do when we gather evidence in a car crash, an accident. We don't take one perspective and say, this is what happened in the accident. Let me write this up in the report. And that's what we'll do. It's like the officer ideally takes the perspective of all parties involved, and not even just the people that got into the car crash, but the observers that are by the side, people that maybe even made the road. So there's a larger idea of like what a perspective is about a particular event. One person does not hold the keys to truth. So I think that's why it's really important to get any perspective, regardless of race or gender, just in general, but in specific. In this case, when we're dealing about a particular identity and a history related to that identity and a value system related to that identity, it's important to include.
Yeah. Bam, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I will say that I've spoken to about a dozen Osage people since 2021 about the making of this film. I took a trip to Pawhuska just to speak to people who are Osage about the making of the film. And that was in some cases a response to what I was seeing in that mainstream media where, everybody's all excited about Martin and worked up about, Apple and Paramount and $200 million and Martin Scorsese, and he's in Oklahoma and he's with Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro, and they're going to be making a movie together. And the Osage perspective seemed to be lost on everybody, that this was a real story based on like real people who actually are still around who might have some say about it. And I will say that they've monitored, that the Osage Nation was monitoring this. Like when the rights went up in 2016, they were watching like who got the rights to it. They had people that they hoped would get it and hoped wouldn't get it. And the Osage people that I spoke to are not unaware of the realities of the world. I mean, they're all aware that if it's going, that you're making a trade-off. It's a trade-off to have Martin Scorsese make your movie. On one hand, he's going to get $200 million. It's going to be a major production. And he seemed, after they talked to him, really they felt like they got through to him, because they will tell you that it was after we had conversations with him. The chief sat down with him. They came into the chief's office, and the chief said, what are your intentions here with our story? And that they were invited to a community gathering in Greyhorse, where Molly Burkhart was from, where people who were elders in the Osage tribe got up and spoke about how their grandparents were killed and all these kind of things, and made it clear, if you're interested in coming to town to make a white savior story, we're not really interested in being involved in that. And so they really feel like they were listened to and they were heard. And that was what led to those rewrites. That it wasn't just, that one day DiCaprio woke up and decided he'd rather play Ernest Burkhart. So I feel like, but they were aware there was a trade-off, right? That on one hand, you were letting someone else tell your story. You were entrusting your story to somebody else. But they were going to get this big budget and get these top names and get these opportunities that no Native filmmaker was going to get. And the exposure was going to be to the extent that no Native filmmaker was going to be able to get. So on the other hand, I spoke to Ryan Redcorn, who was one of Sterling Harjo's contemporaries and collaborators, who said, it is frustrating to know that I have children who are Osage, that the perspective that people have about who they are is going to come from this movie, and I have no control over how this piece of cinema is going to be made. And that's going to determine how people look at me and my children and my family, because that's the perspective that they get. So I think that it's important to note that the Osage people were aware. You're making a trade-off. You get Martin Scorsese to make your movie. He seems to be a good ally, and he has good intentions, and he's going to get all of this attention and all of these opportunities. But no, he's not an Indigenous person telling the story. So he can only do the best that he can do to tell it. And I feel like that's a fair perspective. Because it's the vestiges of the racism. No, it's not a question of, can you get 12 white men to convict a white guy for killing an Osage person? But it is still a vestige of racism, right? That certain people get to make $200 million movies and certain people don't. So I feel like it's the reality that we live in, and that it's not like the Osage weren't aware of it going into the film. So I think that all the ones I've talked to are happy with the film, but there is this a little bit of I don't know if it's bittersweet or something like that. There's a little bit of an asterisk to it of, would have been better if we could have been, lived in a world where we could tell our own story. But if you lived in that world, there probably wouldn't be this story, right? Like, this story wouldn't exist if we lived in that ideal world.
We would have known about it sooner, probably.
Sure.
If it had happened.
Yeah.
Well,
So I guess that's my thought, and that's me sharing the thought of what the Osage people have shared with me. I have a completely different perspective as a woman, because I would never try to take that Native perspective, which is that I love that Sunrise mentioned that scene of the sisters on the blankets talking in Osage about these guys that they're hooked up with. I would have loved to have seen someone like Erica Tremblay get her hands on a scene like that, because I think it's important to note that the heart of this story is Molly, but it's being written by two guys. And there's a romanticism, I think, of the relationship between Molly and Ernest that I think it's important to note that until in my lifetime, the last 40 to 50 years, is only when women in America have been able to live financially independent lives. We're talking like late 20th century, post 70s.
But when this movie is set, women would not be able to do that.
No, not at all. I mean, there is no opportunity. So throughout history, women forming relationships with men isn't just romance. It's a survival skill, because you can't survive as a woman in the world in the 1920s without a man.
Yeah.
So I think that it would have been interesting to see that scene or scenes like it explore those issues. Like, they're very aware of the fact. They're not duped in that scene that these white guys are coming around because they want their money.
Well, no, I mean,
They're not
calls him a
confused.
coyote. He looks like a coyote, right?
They're
Right.
not confused here. But it would be interesting to hear their perspective on, is the hope of what you're going for? Do you hope that maybe, like, if you marry a white guy? Because a lot of Osage women did. That's why all this was allowed to happen, was so many Osage women married white men, right? Did they marry these white guys hoping that they become the guardian of your fortune, and then instead of some rando banker holding your money, maybe your husband gets it, so it's one step closer? I mean, is it a social structure thing? I mean, is it better to be married to a white ne'er-do-well than it is to be married to another Osage? I would have loved to have seen it explored from a woman's perspective of, look, we got to marry somebody, right? I mean, Molly herself, they even mentioned she was in an arranged marriage with an Osage before she married Ernest. And then her mom was mad because all 4 of them married white men, including 2 of them that married the same one. I would have loved to have heard more of the psychology of why so many Osage women married white men. Like, what were the social and financial sort of settings that made that but I think you have to be a woman to explore that. You can't be a couple of guys who look at it romantically of, oh, well, they were in love, of course. And it's like, yeah, because all women married for love always in the history of the world, where you have to have one in order to get to live. So
Yeah.
I want to briefly say that now this is not real advocacy, but I feel like what you're talking about is briefly in there for like 2 or 3 beats. In the moment where she's sort of assessing him, she's like, why do you live here?
Yeah.
You know,
It's a great scene. The iconic scene from the still image we got, that was all we had for this film for 2 years.
Yes.
Which, by the way, was one of my favorite scenes in the movie. Yeah, when she's asking those questions.
Yes. But it feels like she's asking these questions to determine, is this the person that's going to help me in my circumstances?
Right.
Yes.
And it felt like it was all practicality, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Including this question about whether or not he's afraid of his uncle.
yes.
Well,
Right.
and she,
It's like she's conveying how much she can tolerate. You know
Right,
what I mean
yeah.
about it. It's
Right.
like, like, I know you're here for my money, but what's the net positive here for me
Right,
in
yes.
terms of what I
Yes.
endure versus So
well, and I think she's sizing up in a lot of ways. And I think one of my hunch is, this is not explicit in the text, but Ernest is not a smart guy. Like, and it's very clear to her that he's not smart. He's an idiot. I mean, to be frank, I mean,
be
Jesse
earnest.
Plemons even later says your uncle took advantage of you due to your disposition.
Well,
which-
he's malleable at least.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh no,
Right,
he's
yes.
he's
Yeah.
dumb as a bag of rocks.
Right. But I think she's looking at him and saying, okay, are you going to hurt me? Are you going to let me do what I want to do? It was a great scene
Yeah.
where she's sizing him up.
Yeah, and I feel like she's also asking, are you going to be able to defend,
Yeah.
against your uncle, who is clearly like one of these, I mean, she's not dumb, right?
Right.
She knows what the potential is. I feel like she's looking for someone that can maybe physically fight, but at least someone who's not willing to, or somebody that could confront his uncle, or his uncle.
Protect her from.
To protect whatever,
Yeah.
From whatever circumstances
Yeah,
that
yeah.
comes about.
But you're right. Like the fact that we don't explore it further, especially among these women. I mean, like, they giggle and it's funny and it's great performances, but it's like there's so much more to explore in that particular scenario of like, what they actually do choose in their own life, and they're going to talk more about it, and they're going to be more practical, and it's not just all the joke, and that would be great to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Angela, what are your thoughts on? I mean,
The
whether-
choice of
who's directing. What does that mean for the text? What are your thoughts? Anything to add?
I mean, I would echo what everybody has said, and I would add this to it. If anybody understands the violence and the corruption that was happening by the white men, it was him. And I think that he went a long way to peel back those onion layers bit by bit. Because, I mean, I just remember I was like, oh my gosh, at certain little bits, little peeks at things. And I was like,
Yeah.
him. Oh, and he's involved too? Really? Just from like one line. We're spoiler free.
We're in spoilers.
Spoilers.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
say everything.
And so like digging for the bullet in the brain.
Yeah. Oh.
That whole, and I was like, oh my gosh.
Very upsetting.
It's everywhere. It's not just the king of the Osage Hills it's this guy, and you know the way that network slowly gets wider and wider, and you see all of the corruption and the
everywhere.
violence.
Wide shot in the room.
You can't trust your doctor.
And everything's dark. And, yeah.
Well, even notice one of the jurors is the KKK guy
Absolutely.
who gives her money.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that had no influence whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely.
on his
Yeah.
decision making.
And it was just a passing scene, and you're just like, oh my gosh, it's that guy.
Yeah.
So I think that he understands that part of it so well that he was able to do justice to conveying that to the audiences in a way that I don't think anybody else would. I mean, you know, anybody who is it? Michael Bay?
Oh, Michael Bay.
What about Michael Bay?
You know,
He does blow stuff up.
blow stuff up.
I will say you mentioned the violence here, and that's something I didn't get to in the spoiler-free section. So he's known for, especially in his 80s early career, for sort of making violence look really cool and stylish. He is definitely 180'd in his late career, and that's I loved seeing that he really, when you watch The Irishman, it's like the opposite. It's the violence is brutal, it's quick, it's disarming, and it's awful. You never feel good about it.
Yeah.
And I like that was something that he deployed. I really feel like The Irishman was the first time he really nailed it.
Yeah.
That he was able to apply to the murders in this film. I mean, even that montage where the woman, the 20-year-old woman, gets shot just on her front lawn with her baby.
Oh my gosh.
It's just heartbreaking, and it's fast, not sexy at all. There's nothing good about it.
It's so
awful.
realistic. I mean, because you feel like
Great
that
actor
really
Ben
is
Hall
what
did that
happened.
scene.
In
I was
Generator.
so jarred to see him be the one that he's such a sweet man. But very effective with
I
that scene.
texted Generator on the second viewing, and I was like, I am so scared for Ben Hall to be around you ever. It's not his fault,
Yeah.
you know, but it's just like this subconscious feeling of like, keep these two people separated.
Yes.
Well, but I also think that there's a great there's this violence, but then there's a sort of great sort of like subtlety to a lot of it that that sort of ricochets back and forth between the subtlety and the unsubtlety. Because on one hand, you have this horribly violent scene, and then you have Lily Gladstone's narration that says suicide. He took the baby and ran off with her.
Right.
It's like, okay, if she committed suicide, where'd the baby go? Like, there's a baby carriage here, guys. How could that be a suicide? That doesn't even make sense. But there's sort of this dry tone where she goes, suicide. Like,
like,
how
come
could
on.
you declare that a suicide, right? I think that you sort of see that with the Brendan Fraser critiques that have come up with the film, where you see him in this scene, and all of a sudden, toward the end of the movie, he's there, and he's like, in this big booming voice, and somebody said it was like the Kool-Aid man bursting through the wall. But I mean, that really,
point.
but
That is
that
the
really
point.
is that
The
really is.
theatricality of
But
it
that's
was
really how David Grand describes it in the book. He's a composite character of the lawyers, but it makes it very clear that it's a miracle that the guys that got convicted because their lawyers turned it into a circus.
Yeah.
Like they talked about the lawyers, like, and that whole deal of like him wanting to consult with his client who is the witness against the other client. That's the actual stuff that happened at the trial. I mean, they're actually depicting how much of how much it was weighed in favor of Hale getting away with it. I mean, how much of a circus that these guys turned it into. It's like, if we can't we'll still get away with it. We'll get away with it by turning it into a zoo. And that they really tried to do that. Yeah. And so I thought it was interesting how you would take these moments that you sort of have these you're having this sort of like interrogation kind of scene that's very subtle and very, sort of like elegantly paced and things like that, where he's breaking down Ernest's character. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you switch to the trial, and here comes Brendan Fraser. Yeah.
Fresh off an Oscar.
Yeah, he's fresh off his Oscar and just bellowing as loud as he can, turning it into a kangaroo court.
You know what else I love about that scene? Not to get off the topic too much, but again, going back to what we were saying earlier about the form. So especially last night, I saw it with a bunch of a group of friends, and we were talking afterwards, and they were like, all right, the movie's almost over. We're in court. And then there's that scene where it goes crazy, and they're like, no, it's like another 30 minutes. It's the same feeling. It's like, yeah, well, they thought the trial was almost done too. Yeah. It was really brilliant filmmaking. Anyway, but see, bringing it back though, that's the kind of like stuff you get with Scorsese.
Exactly.
So there are things you get. There's just also a lot of things you don't get.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, like, to Angela's point, it's not that the psychology of Leo's character and the psychology of Robert De Niro's character is not valid to the story. It is. It's like because they could have skated over that and not gave them any nuance and just made it like, we get the first conversation we have is like, like this, the seeds being planted about what's going to happen, and just the intricacies and the subtleties of each decision made, and all the way down to him marrying her and why he should marry her and all that. And so I don't think that there's no value in seeing their point of view and how far they were able to go with it. I just think you come into the film and I think your enjoyment, it's hard to say enjoyment, you know what I mean? But your appreciation for the film, I think is going to have different varying results depending on whether you're going to see it to get the information versus like the psychology of like Molly's character, because that is what's missing, is more of that.
Right.
I think the single most like effective like moment where I was like hanging on to her every word, it's in the trailer as well, is when she's walking through the train station and we get her inner thoughts about the men around her. You can see the rage in her eyes. You can see her like, I should kill these white men who did this to me.
All these white people who are staring back at her.
Staring back to me. I love that. And I wanted more, like maybe 3 more sequences like that, even if it was just, and just her mindset during that, because that's the soul, that's the heart of the story. You know what I mean? Everything surrounding it is just kind of the mechanics of it. You know what I mean? Like how it came to be.
Now, I don't disagree with you. What I will say, though, is, again, it's all about who's making the film, main character.
No,
the advantage, again, not better or worse than, just the advantage of choosing Ernest as the main character, with Lily Gladstone having a prominent role, just not the main character, is... And also their choice to reveal from the get-go who's doing the murder. I mean, from the get-go, which from my understanding the novel, it's more of a mystery or a long play.
Yeah.
The advantage to that is we get a very Scorsese. He's showing, well, how could this have happened? Well, let's show you how it happened.
Yeah.
From the guys who did it and how they manipulated the system, how they're able to take advantage of just how complicit and how complacent also both the citizens of the area were to the Osage people. I mean, there is an advantage if you're trying to do the kind of the critique of
the systemic way that this was able to happen,
right,
and how they came about. And I think too that his approach to the story, the rewriting of it, is probably the best thing he did for the film.
Absolutely.
Because had it been told the other way, I think we would have had far more criticisms than we have today. And I think that it's still not enough, I would say. But I do think that by shifting the focus to that relationship, we were able to get a more personal, intimate, involved. We wouldn't have cared as much. I think particularly we had a face to put it on. And Molly is the stand-in for the Osage people in this story. You know what I mean? At large, you know what I mean? And I feel like, by giving that relationship weight, you know what I mean? Like the peeling of the onion, as you said, of the corruption and everything happens. Like, again, it's all like she's our surrogate character too, you know what I mean? To and embrace all those details. And I think that had they focused more on the case, it would have been more of a courtroom procedural. Probably still would have been sturdily made, but not. It wouldn't have. I don't think it would have had the emotionality.
My understanding from the original version was that Molly Burkhart was boiled down to just a handful of scenes, and she got like a big monologue, and then
and Ernest was also sort of similarly one of the conspirators with his uncle, but not, and the one who basically became the one to testify, but not to this extent. And I do think that you're correct, and I don't want to take away anything from Leonardo DiCaprio or his performance or anything like that, because I do think that it's what I thought struck me on the second viewing, and it speaks to a little larger issue, is you think about, from a female perspective, I think about like, how could Molly Burkhart fall in love with this person? And I think that was one of the Osage consultants who spoke, who was kind of had really mixed feelings about it, was like, that's not love, that's abuse. And that's not the same thing. But I think that what I caught the second time of watching it is, and what Ernest won't admit to, and in terms of like, he never, as far as he's concerned, did your uncle try to get you to marry this woman? He said, no, I fell in love with her when I met her driving my cab. And the things that he won't admit to her at the end, the truths he will not speak, is that Ernest is convinced that he loves this person. Ernest believes it, and the reason Molly believes it is because Ernest believes it.
Until she realizes that he can't confront the hard truth.
Until he can't confront the hard truth. Then she realizes he may have convinced himself, but he didn't love her. And I think that also speaks to the wider issue, is that the reason why so many Osage people fell for it was that the white people involved had convinced themselves this isn't really wrong.
Yeah.
Because all I'm doing is taking advantage of Indians who are dying anyway. All these Osage people will be dead soon. The government's been trying to kill them off for years. So they convince themselves it's not really wrong. It's not really that bad. And so I think that's the reason why, and I think that that's one of the things that Hale says at the beginning. They're smart. The Osage people couldn't have it just taken away from them. You had to trick them into it.
They don't talk much, but they're smart. They know everything that's going on.
But they had to be deceived into it. And the way she was deceived, she was such a smart person, the person that was in charge of taking care of her whole family, she was taken in by Ernest because Ernest believes it. Ernest believes he loves her. And so that's why she believes Ernest loved her, is because Ernest believes it and can't even admit it at the end, that he was literally trying to kill you the whole time. And he can't admit it.
Yeah. Well,
So
and
I
even
thought
if
that was
he
really
didn't know he was trying to kill her, that's what he was doing. I think that's a great, I guess we might jump right ahead, but like that's a thing where I think he believes everything he's saying, even if he does not actually, in his heart of hearts, believe it. I think it's a sin. A lot of people, but especially white people, are really good at just like convincing themselves that things they do aren't terrible. Convincing ourselves that this nation wasn't built off of murders of entire nations. Like it's like, and that's kind of the thing that's the sin that I feel like Ernest, and especially when you put it into a final point at the end, sort of represents. Oh, he's just a white dude who's convinced himself he hasn't done anything wrong. He just loved his wife. But no, you did do a lot of terrible things to her, whether you want to admit it to yourself or not.
Yeah.
Sunrise?
There's a couple things here, but first, it's interesting how you give him the benefit of the doubt that he has to convince himself, or that there's maybe a choice. The way that he paints Ernest to me is a way in which he does not even recognize that the system is sort of pushing him through this, and there's no need for him to convince himself, because he just believes. I don't even know if he has to believe. He just does.
Yeah.
Right. And the system just propels him through it. His uncle just guides him through it. That's one thing that I think is happening.
He's very impressionable.
Absolutely, very impressionable.
And he's not. He thinks he's the smartest person in the room, but he's really not nearly as smart or as clever as he thinks.
And
he
he
is.
loves money.
And he loves money.
And women.
Women was second.
Yeah,
to
that's
money.
true. Yeah. Women are second. Although he has no prejudice over which women.
Which kind of women?
Interesting. Yeah.
Which was interesting.
But this is related to like voice. Like what we're talking about here is the result of an individual who's making these distinctions here. Maybe an individuals, so like Scorsese and Roth. The fact that he is making these choices so that we are thinking about how unmotivated this character is, and how uneducated they are, and how the system has an influence on him. This is coming from Scorsese.
Yes.
Right? And this is thematic. We can see this in his other work.
Sure.
He's really incredible articulating what a system is and how it has an influence on those that participate. And, like this is important to allow people who may not be within a community to be able to speak about a community, because observers have just as much information and they see things that those that are heated with emotion and with the inside that sometimes can't see. Right. And I think there are definitely individuals that are Osage, that are Caucasian in the story, that are very similar. They don't see the way that a system has positioned them into a certain action. And very specifically, there's like the moment that the grandparents to Ernest, or maybe the parents, they're sitting at the table and they're sort of like judging.
Oh, yes.
I think it's the aunt and uncle, according to the book.
Yeah,
I
okay,
didn't
yeah,
get
so-
that from the.
yeah.
I didn't get that from
They
the.
didn't
Were they
specify.
talking about the siblings?
Yeah,
Yes.
they're talking about the
How
children.
many times have we heard that conversation?
Yeah, this amazing moment.
Yeah.
Because it's
amazing. Ugh.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because it's very rarely depicted. But talking about the skin color on one side of the table, of the one side of the room, and we are very clearly indicating that there's a prejudice toward the lighter skinned child over the one that is darker skinned or looks more native. But just prior to that moment of prejudice, which I feel like is something that Indigenous audiences recognize, we have the mother of the three women also making a judgment based on a prejudice of, why are you marrying all these white men? I mean, the system is putting those men into a position where they're taking advantage, so we understand that, but she is also biased. And this is something that also happens. It's sort of like the belief of blood quantum. You know, there's an interesting sort of like analysis of this. And I think he's being critical of the mother as much as he is being critical of the aunt and the uncle.
Yeah.
And they are both succumbing to prejudice because of this particular system.
Well, at some point, the elders do point out that the next generation will no longer speak their language.
Right.
We'll be marrying people that are not of their... I mean, they basically predict what's happening now.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the first scene of the movie that they do that. They lay it out and they're like mourning the death of their culture, which is
Absolutely.
and that's a heartbreak at the very outset of the movie.
Absolutely. But
this is the incarnation of that.
Yeah, this is the incarnation of that. But at that moment, I felt like was being critical of Tantu, an elder, a cinematic elder. But the fact that we see the sort of like prejudice from an individual that we normally associate as being the victim of prejudice. Everybody is culpable here in this scene, and this is the thing of Scorsese, is that the victims are also perpetrators of prejudice in this particular circumstance.
And that's something that we don't say out loud to each other.
We don't say it. No, absolutely, and we probably wouldn't say it. I would be fearful to do that,
for
especially
the repercussions in
absolutely.
community.
Yeah,
absolutely not.
Yeah, and so the fact that he's able to go to that place in a way that I feel like an Osage director would not.
Yeah.
Is the benefit.
That perspective probably.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the benefit of having an individual that's outsider make a comment about things that they're seeing. And that was incredible to me.
I think that he also does a really great job. As you guys were talking about, you know, why would she be with him? Why would she be in this relationship? Because it was normal. That was a normal relationship in the 1920s. And Indigenous women historically have shouldered the weight of their community and its continuation. And so you see how much she's striving to keep things going normally. And and when the house explodes and she screams,
That's gets me every time too. I'm telling you.
It's a rough scene.
Well, because she knows when he opens the door. Like, he didn't even have to say anything. He doesn't even really have to shake. He shakes his head, but he doesn't even really have to shake his head. She already knows.
she knows.
She
already knows.
Yeah. She's been a fear. I mean, because of everything else that's been occurring, this is like the worst news she could get. She's like, I've been sadly waiting to get this type of news, especially there's all sorts of like, they imply there's a lot of rumors spreading around the town about another murder, you know? Yeah. So when it comes, it's like, you just.
And they know it's coming. Yeah. People are leaving.
Yes.
They have the lights on their front
put the
yards.
lights out.
Yeah.
And they're just waiting. They're just waiting for it.
And that's why I thought was so important about the point you made earlier. And it was also something that when I spoke to Chief Sandy Ware was something I had not considered before, was how many Osage people left. They fled from this place that they had worked so hard to make theirs. Because if you know the full history of it, you know that the Osage got bumped around just like every other native tribe by the U.S. government until they finally picked the most worthless piece of land that they could find and said, can we buy our own reservation if you promise never to move us again? And that was what set them up to even be. And that was interesting at a panel that I was at last week that had David Grant, it had Chief Standing Bear, but it also had Governor Anatobi of the Chickasaw Nation there. And he mentioned the Chickasaw never even got a chance to do that because the Osage were smart. They eventually decided they were tired of moving, and they bought their own land so that they could not be moved anymore. So they owned it. So the government couldn't just say, oh, well, there's oil on it, so now you have to leave. They owned it. So the best they could do was cut it up and figure out how to exploit them.
Yeah.
And so they figured it out. And according to Grant's book, and they knew there was at least some oil on there. They were not completely ignorant of the fact that there was oil. They had no idea how much.
Yeah.
Nobody knew how much there was. But that they basically had said, but Anatobi's point was that the 5 tribes didn't even get that opportunity. Like, they were exploited they'd never bought their own reservation. They never decided to pool their money and say, we want to buy our land here and never move. And so I think that's an interesting aspect of it as well, is that he does acknowledge the Osage were smart. They set this up to where it's theirs.
Yeah.
You have to take it from them.
And they did.
And they did. But I think that it's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about how many people were dispersed off of this homeland that they had done all of this to have, to bought it themselves, staked a claim on a piece of land that everybody thought was worthless, and said, we're going to make our stand here. And then hundreds and thousands of them leave because they're afraid of being killed.
Didn't the Tall Chiefs, they went to California?
They moved to California.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we're gonna have to move along due to time, because there's so much to talk about. I think maybe we can just really quickly. We were kind of touching on it a little bit. Just the kind of, I'm gonna just transition to the ending piece, and we can ad lib as needed from there. But I want to bring it back to sort of the confession. Ernest does confess his crimes in the court, and then has that final interaction with Molly where he says, "My soul is clear. I've done the things.
Told
I
all
just
the
want to
truths.
I've told all the truths, and I want to be back to you." And then she asks him about the insulin. What I don't know about you all, and I don't. This is probably some of the thing that was probably written for the movie to a certain degree, would be my suspicion. But this is the moment in the movie when I just the weight of the whole movie gut punches. You just like break on the inside, where this guy really can't come to terms with the fact that he's been murdering her family and trying to kill her this whole time. And that up until that moment, she wanted so badly to believe that this guy was protecting her. It's just deeply, deeply sad and tragic. And I think, likely underscores a lot of the larger macro relationship between, America and the Osage. I just want to turn over to you guys. What did you guys make of this final interaction? Laron, I'll start with you on this.
I feel like this will be her Oscar clip, because I think that it conveys so much, because she's already, after the confession, we don't get many cuts to her when he's giving the confession in the courtroom. I was longing for that. I was longing to see how she was processing every confession in real time as he was saying it. And they kind of wisely don't show that, so that this subsequent scene can have more impact. And it's almost like at this point, the only thing she wants to know is that piece of information. And his inability to say it answered the question for her. And there was nothing else left to be said at that point. She needed to hear him not respond, in front of her in real time. And she just leaves. And, she doesn't press him. She doesn't ask him to keep, are you sure? I'll give you another chance. Nothing like that. It was like, that's all I needed to know. She needed to validate it for herself that, and that does it. It carries so much weight, just that, that at that point, there was nothing left. There was nothing left for her to ask at that point. So,
yeah,
I found that scene very powerful.
Yeah. Bam, what was your take on the final interaction between the two of them?
I thought it was, I think you're right. I think it'll be her Oscar clip, and she better win. Dang it.
Fingers crossed.
We'll see.
Oscar, don't make me come. I had to come after them after a few things last year.
Don't put too much weight into that, but it'd be nice. It would be nice.
Yeah, it'd be nice.
It'd be nice.
I don't think it's going to happen.
I don't, yeah.
That's the best. Yeah, it'll be nice. It'd be nice. Be nice.
Yeah.
Give it to her.
They're going to be like, oh, well, we nominated you. You're going to have to be satisfied with that. And Emma Stone with her one eyebrow is going to get it, and I'm already mad.
Emma Stone's going to get it.
So, I didn't even see that movie. I'm already mad, Laron. You're going to have to hold me down during that screening.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was incredible from the perspective that it fit a lot of the history. It was true to life, and it was also a very powerful scene because from everything that I have read in David Grant's book and elsewhere, Molly stayed married to Ernest through all of these trials and went every day to every trial, the trial of watching his brother be tried for her sister's murder. All of them, went through all of them. And when all the trials were over, she divorced him. It wasn't until the very end that she basically, once she'd heard everything, she decided she'd heard enough and she was done. And so I thought that it was an interesting way of sort of consolidating all that history into a moment that was a scene that obviously was a scene that had to be contrived. I mean, you know, we don't know what happened when they met, you know, face to face. But I thought that it was, really well done, just a masterfully done scene, because it sort of sums it all up, right? I mean, he can't admit it, but that's what tells her what she needs to know. Yeah, you did it. Okay. That's all I needed.
Yeah.
I can be done now. So I thought that was pretty incredible scene. Now hurry up and get to the part where we talk about the ending.
Oh, the ending? Okay, real quick. Angela or Sunrise, anything you guys want to add about the final interaction between Ernest and Molly?
I would have liked to have seen more of her coming to that realization that when she sits down and asks that question, that's the turning point for her. Whether it would have been cutaways during the trial, whether it would have been some conversation in the hospital when she's recovering. I mean, just anything along the way to where we get to that little button up would have built on that Oscar moment.
Lily Gladstone's performance definitely, I mean, I totally bought that scene without what you just described, but I think it's purely, not the script, it's purely her performance, because she's just wears so many different emotions on her face, and you're like, oh, she's thinking something, and you know, every time she's on camera. But I hear that. It's definitely not in the script, that's for sure. Sunrise?
I had all the same responses, particularly about her perspective being missing and her Lily's performance. But that moment for me really is a summation almost of the structure of the film for me. And that's related to Scorsese's approach to structuring in these last works, which is this sort of like seesaw. Guilty or not guilty? Does he know? Does he not know? Is he a lover or is he a hater? Is he a savior or is he a devil? Is he a husband or is he a perpetrator? This goes back and forth all the way through the film, and it kind of finally puts into a moment of settling based on her decision. You know, and I felt like that was really smart, just to, you know, give this particular woman the agency structurally. I don't know if it's the best because of the perspective that we're talking about is missing. But this is something that just seems to be consistent, again, with his particular voice. This is what comes with the voice. And this is what I think is happening in silence, right? Is he, you know, is he crazy? Is he not? Is he the example? Is he worthy? Is he not? Is he a Christian or is he Buddhist? Is he not, you know, I feel like that's happening in Shutter Island. Is he crazy? Is he not? Yep. And ultimately, at the end of all of these films, including The Irishman, does he know? Does he not know? Is it real? Is it not real? Is it memory or is it fact? At the end of all these films, what's interesting is it's both.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult thing for any person to accept. Like, that's the contradiction of humanity. And that really puts Scorsese in this position where he's a master. And at the end, he's both, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate that it's also tied into like this fictive element of the love story. He is both a perpetrator, but he's also a lover. He's the savior, and he's also the devil.
He was poisoning himself too.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And in a way, a victim himself. I mean, because he was definitely taken advantage of by his uncle, and he's definitely a perpetrator as well.
Scene in the Masonic temple.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's hard for me, and that's such an interesting scene too, because it just goes to show you just the entitlement of Hale and how he really doesn't view him as anything more than a child. I mean, he's
right.
And you see it later in the scene where he comes to tell him about the lawman show, where he grabs him by the ear like you would a child.
He literally spanks him.
Like a kid.
Right, yes.
So I mean, I think that you sort of see that to him he is a very childlike person, and that's the kind of like thrall that his uncle has over him. Sunrise would be interesting. I don't know whether I bring this with me, or maybe Scorsese even anticipates that. But I also see that scene as so indicative in the time period that we're living in right now, where people are talking about, could we even teach Killers of the Flower Moon with House Bill 1775 and some of these kinds of things, some of these laws that are in place? Can you even teach Killers of the Flower Moon now in school? I mean, no. I think it's one of those things that whenever she says, have you told all the truth? And it's like, I can't admit to what I've done.
Yeah.
Okay, that to me seems very reflective of the societal moment that we're in. Can you tell all the truths, or can you not admit?
Or do you even know? Is there even, do you feel like, I mean, everybody thinks that their truth is truth.
Right.
But I'm also, again, just the earnest reaction there, it just captures what a sentiment I'm sure a lot of us have picked up on from a lot of people, where they're like, no, that's not true, or that is true, but they've convinced themselves that it's the opposite. Wait, can you teach this thing? Well, that thing never happened. Well, here's this movie that's with all this backed up information that says it did happen in this state, in this country. So did it happen or did it not happen? It happened. Okay, can we teach it? Well, no, why not? You know what I mean?
Because it would make white kids feel bad.
Right. I'm just saying that's. I feel like he's.
But how does it make Native kids feel?
Right.
Or
that's the problem.
As far as the Tulsa Race Massacre, how does that make African American kids feel?
Right.
We can't talk about African American excellence because then we have to talk about how black people tore it down.
You did read the very first Constitution of the Oklahoma, right? The state of Oklahoma.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Very first law passed is a Jim Crow law.
In school, you're fine. In school, it's Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Like those are the figures that encompass the entirety of Black history, and at least in my education. And I mean, I knew better.
One of them is definitely depicted as more desirable than the other.
Absolutely, right, and there's gray zone there too. I mean, people forget that Martin Luther King was also radical in certain ways too.
Right. Because they only talk about the very specific things they liked about him.
Exactly. Right, yeah. It's every holiday. It's they get his quotes, but they forget all the underlining. And that's because we don't talk about that aspect of it.
When he was assassinated, which indicate that he was not liked by everyone, of course.
Yeah.
75% of the American adults hated him. Yeah. They all thought he was a horrible thing for this country. I mean, and I think that
he was a complex human being. There was a lot more to him than the little sliver that we romanticize about.
Well, he at one point said that the biggest threat to racial inequality was the complacent moderate whites. You know what I mean? I'm just saying, like, and then, I brought that up because you see on Ernest's face a reaction I see from a lot of people when you try to ask them questions about things like that. No, it's not easy truth. It's awful. But did it happen or did it not happen?
So just out of curiosity, can you name an indigenous equivalent to Martin Luther King or Malcolm X in what you've learned in school?
No.
Not a single one.
Not from what I learned in school. And I was actually thinking that exact same thing. There isn't even a Native American equivalent to it.
No. In fact, when I was in New York to see the Thanksgiving play, and I went with my friend, and she was talking about how Broadway is becoming size inclusive and da-da-da-da-da. And here we're going to see a play written by an indigenous woman. I said, but do you see any indigenous stars on any of the stages?
Yeah, and what about the director? And the ticket buyers and the producers.
Yeah. Our erasure has been very deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that this is getting sunlight is very important.
Yeah. Well, with that said, we're going to move on and talk about the final scene of the movie. Bam, your time has come. The ending. So the film's ending, of course, immediately after that scene where we see the fallout between Ernest and Molly, we cut to a live radio broadcast produced by the FBI and Lucky Strike some decades later. A real show, by the way, for listeners who aren't familiar. It revealed the fates of each of the characters, with Scorsese himself stepping on stage to read Molly's obituary and the final line about her death, which was that there was no reference to the murders in the obituary. And then we cut to the Osage in present day celebrating some sort of celebration.
Can I start this one?
Yes, go for it.
So if you talk to our grandparents about anything, any traumas, residential schools, removal, my grandmother, when her Alzheimer's got really bad, she would see the soldiers chasing her. But prior to that, if they never talked about it, this is something that they never talked about.
Yeah.
And so it didn't surprise me that her obituary left that out, because to her, we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's in the past. My grandpa Pruner was like, no, you have to learn the ways of the enemy in order to survive this life. He had been taken to residential schools. So we don't talk about it. It's not mentioned. You move on in order to survive.
Which brings me, I think, is actually a really important context to notice it's Scorsese. It ties back to the who's telling the story question. Scorsese himself literally stepping in and saying there was no mention of the murders. Did he tell a story that might not have gotten told by the Osage? In a way. You know what I'm saying? Like, if there's no mention of the murders, would it, and I just, he's kind of like, my perspective is he's stepping out here to bring in the audience and say, hey, look, this awful stuff happened and we're sitting here digesting it like a podcast. We're actually part of it right now, technically.
Yes.
In a way.
Audio.
Yes.
Missing information.
The FBI is great. We love them. No, not really.
Oh, there goes that file open.
Yeah. So that's number one. Number two, it feels very much like Scorsese acknowledging that he has limitations to how he can tell the story. He's like, all this stuff happened. I did the best I could. And there was no mention of the murders. Here's what I got. But also, it's not the whole story. And which is why it was really powerful that they cut to the Osage in the final shot.
And then, so just in case you guys don't know, their creation story is that they come from the stars. They mention it in passing in the show. But their creation is that they come from the stars. And what I really appreciated about that last powwow scene is how the crane, or not a crane shot anymore,
Drone.
how the drone shot comes up and then the whole thing looks like a galaxy. I loved that.
That's an incredible detail. I had no idea.
Yeah, I didn't pick that connection.
That's awesome.
That's
But I thought that was really beautiful.
The layers of the ending I love, because the ending is based on reality, that the FBI, that was actually part of Hoover's plan. You know, when we got the Hoover representative, he's never in there. But, you know, if you read the book and you know some about the history, this was really was meant to be a foundational case for them to really establish the FBI. And part of how they sort of mythologized it and sort of burnished its status was through this case. And other big cases, they partnered with Lucky Strike, and Hoover had writers, and he actually did weigh in on the writing of these radio scripts that mythologized big cases of the FBI. So I love it because it's based in fact, but I love it because the radio plays were all about the FBI. They weren't about breaking down what happened to the Osage afterwards. So you're taking this format that was used by the system, the white leader of the FBI, to basically play up their role in it, and you're taking it back and you're making it the eulogy for Molly, basically.
Yeah.
It moved me to tears both times when he read her obituary.
It got me good.
I thought it was interesting that Scorsese chose himself. He's not uncommon for him to choose to put himself in his films as a cameo. You hear his voice in a couple of other places.
Yeah, 2 other times.
But he absolutely steps up to the microphone to be the one to read her obituary, which I thought, to me, indicated the impact that the story had on him and the experience had on him. But I also think I felt so many emotions whenever he read her obituary. The idea that she got to have a life that was somewhat peaceful after all of that. That she got to have a life where, and it's such a mixed blessing, right? Or a mixed curse that the murders aren't mentioned. You know, that she does get to have that sort of quiet obituary where it's not bogged down with all of that grief and sorrow. But at the same time, you have then the erasure of all of this very important history that happened. And you don't know at the end of it, because of who's doing the reading and all of this that we've talked about, you don't know whether she would have chosen for it to be that way or whether she would have chosen to make the murders part of it and it was suppressed. You don't know. You don't know what she would have picked for herself out of it. And so to me, that was just such an interesting ending that it was not mentioned in her obituary, because it was like, was that her refusing to speak the trauma and not wanting that to be brought into her obituary, or did somebody say, well, we've already forgotten about those, we've already put that out of our mind?
I mean, just based on my experiences, it would be her not even considering that being part of her life.
I think that's a historical
and
accuracy.
if that's the case, good for her.
But I think there's an aesthetic choice there, or an effect, I guess. The ending is very much like Barbie to me. Where we have this this narrative in which everyone's trying to control this woman's outcome, and essentially removing or tricking the agency from her own decision making. And the final moment there is so powerful because she finally is able to just walk away. The scam is over. She does not have to rely on him anymore. She can go have the life that she wants. And, you know, the filmmaker here, has nothing to do with her life, also has no control over what we see and what we don't see. The character has complete control, and we're left in this mystery. Why? What? How long? How did she feel? It kind of doesn't matter, really. At the end of the day, the same thing with Barbie, where it's like, it doesn't really matter why she's getting the test or like going to the gynecologist. It doesn't matter what her identity status is. What matters is that she's able to make the decision by herself and have that decision. And it doesn't, what information we have and who has control over that information doesn't matter.
I adored that ending, even if I had to explain it to a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Incredible. Yeah. I will say that it's also incredible that the limitations that we recognize, like the sound effects of the show, are obviously fabricated and fake, and it's exactly what we're talking about. He's doing the best that he can. That there's also the recognition of like the sponsorship, interceding.
Yep.
But then also it parallels the beginning. I think all the information is told to us about. She talks about the murders. That's like the first thing we hear from Molly. Us as an audience, we hear who's been murdered. We know their name. We know what's been described about them, and she's already talked about it. And by the time we get to the narrative, at the end of the narrative, we already know as an audience, we know that that's the case, and we know that she can do it. She can talk about this, but she's choosing not to at the end. So I feel like those two things really have to kind of work with each other, and that's like a masterful thing on part of Scorsese, the fact that he's balancing it out from the beginning to the end. Again, I think this is also about, you know, obviously it's him on stage, obviously it's him in front of the storytelling, and he's also sort of like implying this sort of white savior narrative, if it's the FBI that we're upholding, and he's complicit. He's on stage with them.
Yeah.
He is the director, probably, you know. And I think that's also a brave thing to be able to say, I am complicit with this, and I will never be able to give you the information the right way from their perspective. And in that way, you know, I think it sort of turns this idea of the white savior narrative in a new direction.
Yeah.
Well, and then the symmetry of the burying of the pipe at the beginning and then ending with the modern day Osage still practicing their culture on that prairie, I felt was so important that he didn't end it with himself.
Yeah.
He didn't end it with Molly's obituary, even though it's Molly's story to whatever limited extent it was able to be. But the whole symmetry of the burying of the pipe, that this culture, they all thought it was dead and buried too, right? We bury the pipe. Our children will speak another language and things like that. But then you come to the modern day Osage, who helped make the picture. They didn't maybe get to lead the picture. They weren't above the line. They weren't the writers and directors, but they helped make it. And they were the ones who brought their language and culture and dance and costumes and wares to the making of the film. And that at the end, they're still going. So all the predictions of Hale and all of the other whites of, doesn't matter if you kill Indians. We've been trying to kill them for decades, and one of these days we're going to kill them. No, you won't. You didn't succeed. Sorry.
My husband, when we watched the film, said that he interpreted that ending, you know, as resilience. That is what this is. Like everything that's been taken from them. Because you can look at it and say, so much is gone, But then you look at this and like, but yet they still
Survive.
but yet the drum still goes. You know what I mean? And I love that. I love that as a button to the end of the film, is that through all this disgusting history that we just dissected, those people are still holding that down. And I love that. And also, I agree with you about Martin Scorsese. I love the last line that he says about Molly's, but I was cringing at one point because I thought I knew what the last line was going to be, and I was wrong, because I thought he said there were no mentions of the murders, and I thought the next line was going to be until now, and my heart, I just thought like, oh, please don't say that, because if you say that, I'm going to hate this moment, and it the fact that he didn't is why I got emotional. Yeah, because it's like he said to himself, like, I'm not taking credit for this story. I'm telling it, but I'm not taking credit for it. I'm not looking for your, I'm not blindsiding this moment where look how good I did, sort of thing, like I brought this story to you. But it's so, that was an important omission that maybe in a lesser film, I think someone would have wrote that. So.
Yeah, just an incredibly creative way, instead of, like you said earlier, doing like a little flash. And here's where they ended up. It was a lot more thought-provoking, and clearly, as you can hear, listeners, a lot of different layers to it, a lot of different things you can bring to it and interpret it. And I look forward to hearing more people talk about the film and the ending after they see it. Like I said, my big takeaway from the ending is twofold, but the big one is we, the audience, are just as complicit to the system that is enabling this violence. And what are we going to do with that? I had a whole other section, listen to the podcast to talk about that, but we don't have time. So with that said, is there any other final words you guys would like to say about Killers of the Flower Moon today?
I hope people see it.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope they don't let the 3.5 hour runtime or whatever, as much as I feel like it operates in an imperfect world, I think it's definitely a worthwhile film. And if you don't know the story, it is a very good entry point into the story, which has a lot of wider implications about what you think you know about American history.
Yeah.
And if you do go see it and you start to explain it to an Osage person, maybe don't.
Don't.
If you're a white person, now's a great time to listen.
Listen.
Yeah.
Always a good time to listen.
That's true. Robert De Niro was really good. Had a whole bit on the podcast. Didn't have time to cover it, but wow, what an evil mofo.
Yeah.
Evil. Do all that.
The way he's able to convey charming with cunning.
He says all the right stuff, gives money to the right causes, and yet everything is ulterior.
Yeah.
Well, and you start to see it. I thought it was brilliant the way you start to see it unraveling. It's whenever the KKK guy goes, you're broadcasting it a little bit at this point.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
At this point, you're taking it a little far, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, not unlike our probably current system of politics.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I mean,
It was very clearly like a parallel to me.
yeah.
Yeah.
I saw it.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that this is related to Scorsese. I'm just sort of thematically talking about Scorsese on this one, but I feel like The Aviator is probably what I see as the closest film to a personal film for him.
Oh.
Because that film, we look at a character who the world perceives one way as a movie maker, but I think the character really wants to be known as someone who does something else. In that case, someone who advances aviation. But I think for Scorsese, I think he really wants to be a historian or a history teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like this film is a demonstration of those particular skills, synthesizing history, being able to articulate why it's important, how it's a reflection of today or vice versa. And those are the skills that I think ultimately we'll walk away with as like, that's why he's a master.
Yeah.
Is he's using the medium, not because he loves cinema, because he understands it enough to be able to articulate something that's important to him, and that's history. And in a time where it seems like history is often overlooked, it feels like the fact that he's done all this work for us is worth our attention. And even if we have our debates about it, the fact that he's done all this work is important.
Yeah.
because-
Someone has.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's like learning history. Somebody's going to be, oh yeah, I never knew about this, and they're going to investigate.
Well, he could just be out there making Marvel movies, and I'm not even joking. You know what I mean? Like this guy is one of the most skilled craftsmen alive at this craft, and he could be making a bunch of other things that would make him a lot more money, frankly. But he's choosing to, as you put it, on historical dramas, really dig into these rich, complex themes about America and greed and white privilege, all these different things.
Well, and isn't it great that, that people will see this, and what you hope is that they will go to Osage County and you can learn a lot about the history of it. The Osage Nation has a great museum. They have a lot of places where you can go and you can learn about this history firsthand. And I think that it will cause a lot of people to make that journey to where hopefully they go to Pawhuska for something more than the Pioneer Woman, which is a whole other subject. But they will go and they will.
You said, is it?
Yeah, is it though?
Well, I will just say the who did Hale sell his land to? Different podcasts.
Yeah, different podcasts. But say at the same time, it's the same podcast. But no, I hope that people go to because there's a lot of great artists, there's a lot of great Osage historians, there's a lot of great Osage storytellers, and they're still there in Osage County practicing their culture. And they are open to you coming to learn about it, as long as you're doing it respectfully. So, I think that's the great part about this is I hope that will cause people to learn more and that they can go to the source to learn about it if they choose to do that. And I hope that people will.
Well said. I think a great way to wrap up the conversation. All right, listeners. Well, this has been an epic, not quite as long as the movie, but creeping up on it. Where can our listeners keep up with you and all of the amazing things you all are doing, either on the internet or out in our communities? Bam, of course, I'll start with you.
Oklahoman.com really is just the website of the Oklahoman. So I'm on whatever they call Twitter these days at BamOK. Makes it sound so much more sexy and mysterious than it is. So, but anyway, I'm on there. I'm on Facebook. But yeah, mostly at Oklahoman.com. You can find the landing page for I worked very hard on the coverage for Killers of the Flower Moon. And I hope that I had a lot of people who made themselves vulnerable and trusted me with their story. And I hope that I lived up to the trust as always. That's what my hope always is.
Well, I will just say I had a lot of friends send me when we were discussing the movie. They were sending me articles, and I looked at the byline, and I was like, "Oh, that's Brandy."
That's nice.
Sunrise Tippeconnie. How about you?
Yeah, you could find me at Sunrise Tippeconnie on Instagram. So it's sunrise.tippeconnie. I do a lot of posting on the stories about deadCenter functions. You can go to deadcenter.org. I'm also on the Reel Indigenous podcast. Angela will probably talk about that. I guess you can follow me on Letterboxd, but it's just... there's no reviews. It's just what I watch.
No, but
I know what he's watched.
I know. I just get
And
to
how
look
many
at.
times.
I guess the list is how I comment about stuff sometimes.
I get to see how many more movies you've seen than me, which is a lot.
A lot.
Like
A lot.
A lot.
Angela, how about you? Where can people follow you and your work online?
So Reel Indigenous podcast is on Instagram under Reel Indigenous Pod. We are also on the artist formerly known as Twitter as Reel Indigenous and on Facebook. And you can find us on your favorite podcasting platform. Our next episode will be with our Osage hosts. We have 2 Osage hosts. Oh. So as soon as they finish processing, because they were understandably cautious about going to see this. So,
Sure.
So as soon as they finish and are ready to talk about it, then we will talk about it.
All right. Well, that'll be one to look out to as another follow-up pod. Laron Chapman?
You can follow my reviews on Letterboxd at black_Cinna_man.
They're so good.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, nothing but a treasure trove of reviews from Laron. Yeah,
I appreciate that, guys. Thank you.
I'm on Letterboxd at C Masters Talk. I'm letter C Masters Talk. Not nearly as occasionally I try to write as much as Laron does, but usually it's just like a tweet. Yeah. But yeah, letter C Masters Talk, Twitter, Instagram. Letterboxd, all the things. Or you can follow us, anything we do here at the Cinematropolis at cinematropolis.com. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey, big shout out to you, Brandy, Sunrise, Angela, Laron, for joining us for this review discussion tonight. And thank you, listeners. We'll catch you again next time when we return on Wednesday, November 15th, with a review of David Fincher's The Killer, because that's the buzzword this year, is killing things. The film debuts on Netflix on November 10th. Until next time.